forced disappearances of Uyghurs into so-called re-education camps and detention camps, the forced sterilization of Uyghur women, the forced aborting of their children, and the state absorption of Uyghur children into orphanages far from home to be reared with non-Uyghur upbringing while their parents are tortured. In 2014, Xi Jinping labeling all Uyghurs who dissented as terrorists, told his officials to, quote, wipe them out completely, destroy, root, and branch, close quote. Chinese authorities initially denied the existence of mass internment camps and have tried to portray them as vocational training centers. Xi Jinping and the Chinese Communist Party employed lies, censorship, and economic coercion to stifle discussions of their crimes. But documents obtained by the New York Times and the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists exposed the brutality behind Beijing's plans to radically and coercively transform the culture of religious and ethnic Uyghurs, Kazakhs, and other Muslims in China. The leaked internal papers show detailed plans now being aggressively implemented to intern between 1 million and 3 million Uyghurs in modern-day concentration camps, where they are subjected to severe human rights abuses and Orwellian indoctrination efforts for those who have been infected. At the same time, Beijing has instituted plans to erase the influence of Islam in all of Western China, bulldozing mosques and shrines, severely throttling all religious practice, and forcing camp detainees to renounce their faith. The leaked documents also show that Xi Jinping himself, I say again, Xi Jinping himself, directed the crackdown, saying that the Communist Party must put the, quote, organs of dictatorship to work and show absolutely, there's a quote, no mercy in dealing with the Uyghurs and other Muslims. In one speech, President Xi said, and I quote him, the weapons of the people's democratic dictatorship must be wielded without any hesitation or wavering. Nor is this hatred of religious and ethnic minorities new. It is the same cruel script that we have seen in Tibet, where the Chinese Communist Party has sought to erase the culture of a proud people. Also, Xi Jinping and the CCP continues to crush democracy and human rights defenders in Hong Kong in violation of solemn promises and treaty obligations previously made. Xi Jinping and the CCP use unspeakable methods of torture against prisoners of conscience. Xi Jinping and the CCP imposes forced abortion against Chinese women who are with child without government permission, as well as forced sterilization. Xi Jinping and the CCP are persecuting believers and all manifestations of faith and spirituality, including Christians, Tibetan Buddhists, and Falun Gong practitioners, in ways not seen since the Cultural Revolution. Xi Jinping and the CCP's complicity in the crime of human trafficking has given them the worst grade by the U.S. Department of State, Tier 3, or egregious violator. COVID-19 has killed 26,000 people in my home state of New Jersey. Approximately 600,000 are dead in the United States and 3.4 million worldwide. Yet more than a year after the pandemic originated in Wuhan, we still don't have an honest accountability of Xi Jinping and the CCP's role, and the lack of transparency is appalling. Yet despite this deplorable record, which again includes genocide, we see the International Olympics Committee, the U.S. Olympic Committee and Paralympic Committee, and a host of major corporate sponsors all affirming the decision to hold the 2022 Winter Olympics Games in Beijing. Big business, as we know, wants to make a lot of money, and it doesn't seem to matter what cruelty, even genocide, that the host nation commits. Besides money, what else does Xi Jinping hope to achieve? According to one of our witnesses today, Susan Lawrence of the Congressional Research Service, among Xi Jinping's stated goals for the hosting the Olympics is, quote, boosting the national pride to be harnessed in a drive for realization of his Chinese dream of national rejuvenation, demonstrating to the world the alleged superiority of China's political system, boosting the global profile of Chinese brands, close quote. Ms. Lawrence will testify that, and I quote, the U.S. Department of Defense characterizes the Chinese Communist Party's quest for rejuvenation as a, quote, determined pursuit of political and social modernity that includes far-ranging efforts to expand China's national power, perfect its governance system, and revise the international order. For Xi Jinping, this isn't about athletic competition. It's about power. We want to aid and abet the CCP's efforts to, quote, revise the international order with dictatorial governance. Whatever were the paper promises the government of the PRC made to the IOC with regards to respecting human rights when the IOC decided to award the Games to China in 2015, it is now absolutely clear that it never intended to honor them. The China fantasy, to adopt James Mann's term, has long been exposed. The notion of that bestowing international honors like hosting the Olympics would ameliorate the Chinese government's behavior, just like the PRC's integration into the world economy would improve China's human rights record, has been repeatedly disproven. Since President Clinton delinked human rights and trade with China in May of 1994, and since China joined the World Trade Organization in 2004, it has exponentially enhanced its ubiquitous police and its military capabilities, and through the use of ever-improving technology, implemented the most Orwellian surveillance system in human history and executes one of the most horrifying genocides right before the eyes of the world. One of our witnesses today, Rayan Assat, will tell us the story of how her brother, a participant in our State Department's International Visitor Leadership Program, was arrested upon his return to China, targeted because he participated in that program. While we have a moral obligation to speak out on behalf of all victims, our State Department has a particular obligation to speak out on behalf of Ekbar Assat, whom, through his participation in that IVLP program, the State Department had adopted as one of its own. And I call upon the State Department, from Secretary Anthony Blinken on down, to call for his release immediately, and to do so each and every time they meet with their Chinese counterparts. This was the policy of Ronald Reagan. Every time a member of the State Department met with their Soviet counterparts, and I know, because I went to the Soviet Union several times and always had prisoners lists in my hand as well. But every time the State Department met, they would hand a list to the Soviet counterparts. Those lists of Soviet dissidents who were unjustly imprisoned, and demanded each of them by name be released. By repeating the name of individuals such as Ekbar Assat, we give a face to what otherwise might remain an abstraction to those who would dehumanize these individuals, each with a father, mother, spouse, sister, brother, and sisters and children who love them. In the early 1990s, when China was seeking to host the 2000 Olympic Games, I met in Beijing the father of the Democracy Wall movement, Wei Jingsheng, in a restaurant in Beijing, who had been released from prison to help the CCP persuade the IOC to select Beijing for the 2000 Olympic Games. After the PRC was denied the Games, however, he was promptly rearrested and tortured before eventually being released under humanitarian parole and allowed to come to the United States in 1997. Wei Jingsheng testified in 1998 before my Human Rights Subcommittee and said that the bullies in the Chinese Laogai and prison camps beat and tortured prisoners of conscience more when U.S. officials kowtow and appease, and less when we are serious, resolute, and penalize barbaric behavior. The PRC, as we all know, was eventually awarded the Olympics in 2008 over the rigorous protests of me and many others. Human Rights Watch, who will be testifying, put out strong statements saying, don't do it. So immediately prior to the beginning of the Games, Congressman Frank Wolf and I traveled to Beijing to raise the issue of human rights and highlight the fact that the CCP was arresting dissidents in and around Beijing to prevent contact with journalists. From this experience, and having spoken with countless numbers of political prisoners of dictatorial regimes, I concluded that when the rulers of these countries know that these individuals are remembered, their situation improves. It is when they are forgotten, when these oppressive governments are apparently rewarded with business investments and the ability to host the Olympic Games, then their situation worsens because the dictators realize there is no accountability for their actions. In granting Beijing host status for the Olympic Games, we are crowning a barbarous regime with laurels, while we should be considering their abuse and genocide. The UN Genocide Convention clearly says a government committing genocide should be, quote, punished. In light of what is now known, and in solidarity with the oppressed and not the oppressor, in solidarity with the victims and not the victimizer, I urge the IOC and all interested parties, including the United States, to find a new host city or a boycott. To our big corporations, don't enable or sponsor the Genocide Olympics. I'd like to now yield to my co-chair, Congressman Jim McGovern of Massachusetts, for any opening comments you might have.
Thank you very much, Congressman Smith, and for convening this timely hearing on China genocide in the Olympics. I'm also happy to be here with Senator Merkley, the co-chair of the Congressional Executive Commission on China. And I want to thank all of our witnesses for being here, especially the distinguished Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi, who has long been a champion of human rights for the people of China. It's an honor to be with all of you. Look, I have the distinction of serving as both the co-chair of the Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission and the Congressional Executive Commission on China. We held a joint hearing 2 years ago on the 30th anniversary of the Tiananmen Square massacre, and I'm pleased that we've teamed up again on an issue of global importance. In less than 9 months, the 24th Winter Olympics are scheduled to be held in Beijing, the capital of the People's Republic of China, a country whose government is committing crimes against humanity and genocide, according to the State Department, a country that is stripping away promised self-government from the people of Hong Kong, and a country that is brutally repressing Tibetans and other ethnic minorities and crushing Chinese lawyers, civil society, and free thinkers. This is not opinion. These are facts. This is not politics. It is reality. The Congressional Executive Commission on China's annual report for 2020 documented how the Chinese government took unprecedented steps in the last year to extend their repressive policies through censorship, intimidation, and the detention of individuals and groups for exercising their fundamental human rights, especially in Xinjiang and in Hong Kong. Today, we have an esteemed panel of experts to inform us on the context in which the Beijing Olympic Host Committee expects the world to, quote, celebrate the Games. I look forward to hearing their assessment on whether the Chinese government is using the Olympic spotlight to improve human rights or whether it has doubled down on its repression. I welcome their views on whether the International Olympic Committee has been responsive to calls to encourage the PRC to change its human rights practices or dug in its heels. And I would like to hear whether outreach to corporate Olympic sponsors to encourage them to use their leverage in favor of human rights has yielded any response, or whether it has been met by silence. Look, unless things dramatically change, the Winter Olympics will be held in a country as its government commits acts amounting to genocide. Is anyone in this hearing comfortable with that? Is anyone in a position of influence comfortable with that? Why are we holding an Olympics during a genocide? Is precisely the question that we, Senator Jeff Merkley, the chair of the CECC, and I intend to ask the International Olympic Committee and the Beijing 2022 corporate sponsors in the coming weeks. To proceed with business as usual would send a horrible signal to all people struggling to exercise their universal human rights and to live in peace and with dignity. Business as usual would require us to relinquish our moral authority to confront other atrocities around the world. Business as usual would put an indelible stain on an Olympic movement willing to celebrate amidst crimes against humanity. An announcement to postpone the 2020 Tokyo Games was made only 4 months before it was scheduled to start. If we can postpone an Olympics by a year for a pandemic, we can surely postpone an Olympics for a year for a genocide. This would give the IOC time to relocate to a country whose government is not committing atrocities. Now, to those who argue that the Olympics should be immune from politics, I say that taking a stance against genocide is not politics. It is about human decency. What does it say about us or the international community if we pretend that nothing is happening? If we gloss over all of this, if we put money and corporate interest ahead of basic and fundamental human rights? Lastly, to the athletes, both American and those around the world, I want to say that the burden should not be on you. We want you to compete and we want you to pursue your dream. You deserve support. The burden is on the IOC to find a host government that is not complicit in crimes against humanity. The burden is on the U.S. Olympic and Paralympic Committee to ensure what you wear and what you eat are not made with forced labor in Xinjiang or elsewhere, and to protect your right to free expression. The burden is on the corporate sponsors to find a way to fully support your training and equipment without having to subsidize one of the worst human rights abusers. I thank you, and I look forward to hearing the testimony.
I thank my good friend and colleague from Massachusetts for his comments. I'd like to now yield to Senator Jeff Merkley for any comments you might have.
Thank you, Congressman Smith and Congressman McGovern, for your partnership in holding this hearing on China, genocide, and the Olympics. It's testament to the urgency of our hearing today that this hearing is drawing extensive bipartisan and bicameral interest, and that Speaker Pelosi is joining us to offer her powerful voice as a longtime and steadfast advocate of the human rights of the Chinese people. In recent years, the Congressional Executive Commission on China has painstakingly documented China's assault on basic rights in Xinjiang, in Hong Kong, in Tibet, among civil society throughout China, and increasingly through the coercion of anybody abroad who challenges the Chinese government's party line. As the chairs of the CECC, Congressman McGovern and I are committed to shining a light on these abuses and marshaling coalitions of human rights advocates, civil society, intergovernmental and interparliamentary partners to hold abusers of human rights accountable and improve the dire human rights situation in China. This hearing is an initial step in what we plan to be a concerted effort to elevate voices speaking out for the powerless in China, and to identify options for Congress, for the US government, for the private sector, for defenders of freedom everywhere to protect human rights that continue to be trampled by the Chinese government. The International Olympic Committee's shameful choice to hold the 2022 Winter Olympics in Beijing and other cities in China sadly makes the Olympics an immediate focal point for our consideration. How did it come to this moment where an event designed to uplift the human spirit is being held in a nation that is crushing the human spirit? As Congressman McGovern said, we cannot proceed with business as usual. As cherished as the Olympic Games are to so many around the world, and as unfair as it is for the burden of human rights abuses elsewhere to fall on athletes who work so hard to achieve the mastery of their sport and to represent their nations with pride. We know where business as usual will lead. It will lead to a government that has committed genocide in Xinjiang, flouted its international treaty commitments to Hong Kong, and run roughshod over international law in South China Sea, to continue such behaviors emboldened and unchanged. So it falls to all of us to set aside business as usual, to explore strategies that give powerful visibility to and support for internationally recognized human rights, that create momentum to change oppressive behavior by leaders and governments around the world, and specifically in China. Today's distinguished panel brings enormous expertise to bear. So let's pay close attention ponder how all of us in our respective roles can entertain such concrete ideas to shape our legislative work, our advocacy work, in order to end the oppressive behavior of China against so many. Thank you.
I thank you very much, Senator Merkley, and just underscore the importance of the bipartisanship, which you have mentioned. I think that's critical. I've served as chairman of the China Commissions on several previous years, and I'm now the ranking member. And Marco Rubio has also served as chairman, is now ranking member. We are all in one accord on this, and I want to thank you for underscoring that important aspect to this. The bipartisanship, despite what some people think about what's happening in Washington, here there is no separation between us. So thank you for that comment. I'd like to now, it's my honor, high honor, to introduce the 52nd Speaker of the House of Representatives. I don't think she needs much by way of introduction, Speaker Nancy Pelosi. She made history as the first woman elected to serve as Speaker in 2007. And when she was elected the first woman to serve as Speaker of the House. For 33 years, she has represented San Francisco's 12th District in Congress. She has led the House Democrats for 17 years and previously served as House Democratic Whip. Perhaps most important to her, she is a mother of 5 and grandmother of 9. I want to add a personal note. Speaker Pelosi has been clear and consistent voice on China throughout her career. She and I have worked together along with Congressman Frank Wolf and David Bonnier from Michigan for years in combating the human rights abuses of China. We fought against the delinking of MFN and trade, believing that if we use a tangible punitive aspect of denying trade or making it conditional, we would see a change in behavior. Unfortunately, that's not the case today, but it was an honor to work with her so strongly on that, and to this day on all things related to Chinese human rights. And I know she has put a particular focus for years on the issue of Tibet. So I thank her, and I know Jim as well feels the same way. We're grateful for that strong advocacy. I'd like to yield to the Speaker of the House of Representatives, Speaker Pelosi.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, for bringing us together on this very important issue. It's about our values. It's about who we are as a country. It's about more than words. It's about actions. Thank you. And I thank you for the years of service that you have given to this. You never have faltered in all of it. I myself have lost my innocence on expecting people to behave in a way that is consistent with their words when it comes to respecting human rights. But matters have only gotten worse in China, as you have pointed out. And the genocide, recognized as a genocide, should be reason for us to change our actions. But it's been an honor to serve with you and with Frank Wolf over the years, and I thank you for calling forth the bipartisanship of this to Senator Merkley. It is Jim McGovern as has Chris Smith, been a relentless, persistent advocate for human rights in China, well, throughout the world. But I've seen him in action, speaking to the leadership of China, going to Tibet, undermining the misrepresentation that the Chinese are making about what is going on in Tibet. We've talked about Hong Kong, we've talked about human rights throughout China. But now this rises to the level of recognized genocide. So when I hear Senator Merkley, I'm so excited that we are reinvigorated with a new, strong voice on all of this, and acknowledge the work of Senator Rubio in all of this. As you both have said, this has always been bipartisan, and that is its strength. And not only is it bipartisan, but we have built our trust that serves us well in other aspects of our lives in the Congress. Okay, so here we are with the Olympics coming up. The Olympics were held in Germany when Hitler was in charge. And what did he say at the time? Who's ever heard? Does anybody remember the Armenians? Remember he said that when they were executing the Holocaust. So it just seems so strange that we would have history repeat itself. But let me just say this. As I said, I've kind of lost my innocence on hoping that corporate America or the powers that be would ever be consistent in what they have said and actions they have taken. I want to join our two co-chairs and Senator Merkley for all three of you for welcoming this distinguished panel. We want to get to them as soon as we can. But we cannot proceed as if nothing is wrong about the Olympics going to China. That may be a fait accompli. It may not be possible to stop that. The last 3 decades have made it clear that we cannot continue to give Beijing a blank check on the hope that their behavior will simply change. As you said, Mr. Chairman, that doesn't happen. When the international community said, let's wait and see, yeah, we wait and saw, and the Chinese proceeded as normal. This is what I do know, because sadly, this is not the first time that Congress and the international community have held this debate. As Mr. Smith mentioned, back in 1993, we all joined Tom Lantos in passing legislation urging the IOC to reject China's 2000 bid for the Summer Olympics because of massive violation of human rights. They did not get it that year, I don't know because of us, but because Sydney prevailed. Then in 2001, again, we joined Tom Lantos and Chris Cox on the Republican side of the aisle to oppose China's 2008 bid, stating the Olympic spirit is built upon peace and respect, as Senator Merkley has said. Peace and respect for universal fundamental ethical principles. Sadly, we are here because the Chinese government continues to crush all political dissent and trample basic human rights of its people. Then in 2008, after returning from Dharamsala, where our congressional delegation was received by His Holiness the Dalai Lama, again, we spoke out calling on President Bush to boycott the opening ceremonies and opposing the torch, and I opposed the torch relay in San Francisco. Unfortunately, President Bush did go to them, but I do want to point out that he did attend our ceremony in the Capitol. We gave the Congressional Gold Medal to the Dalai Lama, which made the Chinese unhappy. And as we know, a similarly disappointing debate took place in the 1990s with China's WTO accession, was simply giving China a blank check as it failed to comply with market commitments. In this very room, the Speaker's conference room, I welcomed the chairman of the Chinese People's Congress in this very room. And when I said to him, you're in violation of the WTO provisions, this in relationship to rubber at the time, he said, when we joined, he and his heads of the committees from the China People's Congress, they said, when we joined the WTO, they said we did not have to obey those rules. So we've given them, again, a free ride. Today, we once again have an opportunity, obligation to speak out. While China has changed over 30 years in some respects, it is appalling that its human rights record has worsened. The U.S. Congress has and will continue our long bipartisan and bicameral commitment to holding China accountable in this arena as with all others. Over the past 2 years, working together, and Senator Rubio very much a part of this, we passed and signed into law the Uyghur Human Rights Policy Act of 2020, and I want to acknowledge our Congresswoman Weston for her involvement in all of this. I know she represents a strong Uyghur population in our country. We passed the Tibetan Policy and Support Act. We passed the Hong Kong Human Rights and Democracy Act of 2019. And already in this Congress, we passed a resolution condemning the ongoing violation of Hong Kong's rights in Hong Kong by Beijing, and the government reintroduced the Uyghur Forced Labor Disclosure Act and Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention, and we'll soon take up another legislation urging Uyghur Human Rights Protection Act. This is all in a bipartisan, bicameral way. As Mr. Smith mentioned, the names of some of the prisoners, for the Chinese government, the most excruciating form of torture is to say to the prisoners, nobody cares, nobody even remembers you're here, and they don't know why. Why don't you just give up? But thank you for your mention, and of course, Wei Jinsheng was a hero. Just we nominated him for the Nobel Peace Prize. He's so fabulous, and now in the U.S., but a victim of China's human rights violations, a real hero to all of us. And he tells us when we speak out, people do hear it in the prisons and in the rest. Again, as I've said, if we don't speak out against human rights violations in China for commercial reasons, we lose all moral authority. to speak out for human rights anywhere. So how sad it is to see the Olympic corporate sponsors look the other way on China's abuses out of concern for their bottom line, with some even lobbying against the bipartisan Uyghur forced labor bill. Imagine they're lobbying against a bill of forced labor when our country has declared this a genocide. Here's what I propose, and join those who are proposing, is a diplomatic boycott. I don't know if it's possible because we have not succeeded in the past. And I'm a big sports fan. I watch the Olympics in the middle of the night. You ever see me during Olympic season? I'm never sleeping. I'm always watching because usually it's in a different time zone. And to see the discipline, the focus, the dedication of our athletes out there is just a source of such pride. Let's honor them at home. Let's not honor the Chinese government by having heads of state go to China to show their support for their athletes. When they come home, let's show them even more. Not you're home now, it's over, goodbye, but even more respect, adulation, really, for what they've done, and to honor all of them, not just the medal winners. But for heads of state to go to China in light of a genocide that is ongoing while you're sitting there in your seats, it really begs the question, what moral authority do you have to speak again about human rights any place in the world if you're willing to pay your respects to the Chinese government as they commit genocide? So honor your athletes at home. Let's have a diplomatic boycott if, in fact, this Olympics takes place. Silence on this issue is unacceptable. It enables China's abuses. Let me end by quoting from testimony submitted today from the International Campaign for Tibet, since Chris, since Mr. Chairman quoted some of the others. The history of human rights violations has taught us a clear lesson. Silence equates with license, and that those who turn away from crimes against humanity bear responsibility for them. If the AOC does nothing to address irrefutable, decades-long, persistent, severe human rights violations in Olympic host countries like China, it becomes complicit. Now the Chinese Olympic Committee has established new standards in the rest. I understand that, but they maintain that they passed those new rules after they awarded China so let's hope that for the future, those new rules. I just want to go back to our friend Tom Lantos. Years ago, I mean, after like 10 years of doing this and still not really having as much success as we would like to have in terms of human rights in China. And by the way, it's about proliferation of weapons and delivery systems that were to rogue nations. It's about violations of our trade relations. It's about a lot of things, including the human rights violations. When I said to him, I said, Tom, we're not making any success. He said, Nancy said, the road on human rights is a long one. You must be patient. You must be patient, but you must be persistent. And in the spirit of Tom Lantos, which I know Mr. McGovern and Mr. Smith both are in the leadership of the Tom Lantos Commission. Thank you for your chairmanship, Mr. McGovern. That it is a long road, and we must be patient. But we want some successes as well, and I think one would be if the countries of the world withhold their attendance at the Olympics and instead save their energy and their enthusiasm for their athletes to welcome them when they come home and give them a beautiful send-off when they go. That would be a giant step forward. I've been told by President Trump that President Xi told him that the people in these education camps, the Uyghur education, really like being there. Really like being there. No, they don't, President Xi. They don't like being there. They like being home with their families. So again, I thank all of you for your courage, for your leadership, for the clarity of the message, and I'm very, very proud of the bipartisanship that has been central to this bipartisan House and Senate, bipartisan, bicameral, all-American support for human rights throughout the world. Thank you all for your leadership.
Madam Speaker, thank you, sir, very much for that very eloquent statement. And it has been an honor to work with you on combating human rights in China for 3 decades and counting. And you're right, it is all about persistence, accuracy. One thing that we painstakingly work for on the China Commission, which again I chaired, I'm ranking member on, and the Lantos Commission, and everywhere else, is to be absolutely accurate. And Xi Jinping knows that we are telling the truth about his barbarous behavior. And one thing that I said during the debate on one of the Uyghur bills was, this is Xi Jinping's genocide. He owns it. He started it. He has maintained it. And to think that he did it simultaneously with trying to get the Olympics Committee and the IOC in 2015, making all of these false assertions about human rights to them. And we don't even know, there's lack of transparency there. Exactly what did they promise? So thank you so much, Madam Speaker. It's so good to see you again. Thank you. I'd like to now, there are some members that are on board here. If there's members who would like to make a very brief statement before we go to our witnesses, be more than happy to hear from them.
Chairman Smith?
Yes, and are there any, yes, who's that? Oh yeah, sure. Tom Swazi from New York. Thank you, Tom.
Mr. Chairman, thank you so much for your great work here. And Chairman McGovern, really just, it's a great honor to serve with the both of you. And Speaker Pelosi, thank you so much for your great work. And I don't know if Senator Merkley is still on, but thank you to him as well. And to all of my colleagues and the panelists, thank you so much. Speaker Pelosi spoke a lot about Tom Lantos, and I like to repeat his quote as often as I can. The veneer of civilization is paper thin. We are its guardians. We can never rest. We've worked so hard, many of the people on this panel, to try and tell people about what the Chinese Communist Party is doing, especially with the Uyghurs, but the Tibetans and the Hong Kong students and others as well. We need to keep on letting people know what's going on, because there's another quote that we often repeat, which is that Winston Churchill said, those that fail to learn from history are doomed to repeat it. And instead of me recounting all the things that our witnesses will talk about and what each of you spoke about, I just want to remind people that when Nixon went to China, we thought that things would get better by now. We thought that as they were exposed to our way of life, to our economy, to our human rights, to our democracy, they'd be more like us. That's certainly not the case. And I just want to remind people about the 1936 Olympics that were held in Berlin. Hitler had been appointed chancellor in 1933. Dachau was founded in 1933. The anti-Jewish boycotts were in 1933. The beginning of the book burnings were in 1933. Jews were not allowed to go to public schools in 1933. 34, Hitler abolished the office of the presidency. He became a dictator. And in 1935, with the Nuremberg race laws, where Jews were not given any civil rights whatsoever, they were no longer allowed to be citizens. But in 1936, we've all seen those documentaries about the 36 Olympics with Jesse Owens competing. And could you imagine if the world community had stood up and said at that time that there would be a boycott of the Olympics or a diplomatic boycott of the Olympics, where we tried to call attention to this, how the world could have been different. So we know this is not some amorphous thing. We know from the work that's been done by our commission and so many others, we know there's a genocide taking place. We know about these forced labor camps. We know what they're doing to these people. So this is an opportunity for us to really just call attention. You know, so many people have worked so hard. I've been on so many panels and so many rallies with so many of you, and I'm so grateful to you for all keeping to continue to bring this to the world's attention. But we know that they don't know. The world does not know what's going on yet. And we need to bring this to the world's attention. And this is an opportunity for us to bring this to the world's attention as to why is the US talking about a diplomatic or outright boycott of the Olympics? Because there's genocide going on there. Because they're imprisoning students in Hong Kong and political prisoners because of the way they've treated the Tibetans. That's why we're doing it. We need to educate the world as to what is happening, and this is a unique opportunity. So I want to thank our chair people. I want to thank the speaker. I want to thank everybody, the panelists, for the great work that you do to help to educate the world as to the atrocities that are taking place under the Chinese Communist Party in China, and I will stand with you, continue to stand with you in our efforts to stop them from doing it, first by educating the world, then by sanctioning them and passing the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act and so many other things that we can do to hold the Chinese Communist Party accountable. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you very much, Mr. Swazi. Are there any other?
Sheila Jackson Lee.
Sheila?
Thank you
Floor is yours.
very much to both of you, Chairman Smith, Chairman McGovern, and to Speaker Pelosi, who has such a long-standing knowledge about this issue and a long record of success. I think it's important to put the obvious out. In February 2022, the People's Republic of China is scheduled to host the Winter Olympiad. Scheduled to host it, which is a symbol of world friendship, world respect and dignity. People will come from all over the world who'll be having elements of the very people that are now incarcerated, detained, and abused. Muslims will be coming. People of many different faiths will be coming. People from individuals from Hong Kong and Taiwan and other places that have been in the eye of the storm with China. The PRCs, however, will continue its highly repressive human rights policies, including practices the State Department deems crimes against humanity and genocide against ethnic minorities, particularly the Uyghurs, and the crushing of the democratic opposition in Hong Kong brought tears to my eyes, have called into question the legitimacy of holding these games in China. I had the privilege of serving under the tutelage of Chairman Lantos as a member of the Foreign Affairs Committee. You could not serve on that committee without feeling his commitment and total DNA to the idea of ending repressive, oppressive regimes and being concerned about the preciousness of human rights and human dignity. China's record of human rights abuses seems at odds with the standards set forth by host cities of the Olympic Games, as set forth by the International Olympic Committee. On December 1st, 2018, the IOC announced it had established an IOC Advisory Committee on Human Rights. Prince Zayed, a former Jordanian diplomat and United Nations Commissioner for the Human Rights, will chair it. And they've come about with some of their results, along with Rachel Davis. Their results, which were published in March 2020, notes that the human rights impacts that could be connected to the 2022 Games are severe, as our consultations with expert civil society stakeholders also confirmed, and addressing them remains challenging. What's the inventory of how many persons are detained, incarcerated, or have never been seen from the last time their family members said they were taken off? How many are going to take an account of the Uyghurs or where they are, how long they've been there? Will they be able to be released before the Olympics? What we always hear when we talk about China is that we must walk softly. We must not upset them. When they went into the Pacific, started grabbing land in the middle of an ocean, and all of a sudden it was Chinese territory. We know China's leader has associated himself closely with this election and his ego and all the great things about China, and appears to view hosting the Games as an important part of his vision for achieving China's national rejuvenation and as an opportunity to promote China's system of governments and its economy on global stage. I sit on the Homeland Security Committee as I conclude. And we know for a fact that the kind of cyber attacks, the manipulation and violation of copyrights, other patent rights, the complete ignoring of any civil society, what belongs to me belongs to me, what belongs to you belongs to you, not under this present leadership and before. And so we know it's journalists, it's human rights groups who have highlighted now the Uyghurs. I've been to Tibet. What's happening with the Tibetans? That was very near and dear to Chairman Lantos and many others. So the goal of the Olympic Charter states that it is to place sport at the service of the harmonious development of humankind, the view to promoting a peaceful society concerned with the preservation of human dignity. We have to ask this serious question as we listen to the witnesses, We heard the excellent framework of the speaker. And I just leave us with this thought. It seems that the overriding deciding factor in our relationship with China is economy, economy, economy. Maybe I should say it's the economy, student. We heard that before, but in a totally different context. How do we, as people of goodwill, who believe in humanity and dignity, who cry at the sight of children being abused, who wonder about democracy and right for its growth around the world, and wonder about now the current group, there are many, so many, the Uyghurs, who have been so much subjected to so many insults, children in boarding schools, state-run. What do we do to hold up the banner of human rights, human dignity? What is our standard? With that, Mr. Chairman, thank you for the opportunity. I yield back.
Thank you very much, Ms. Jackson-Lee. Any other members who would like to say something at the opening or perhaps ask our speaker a question?
Is the speaker still here, Mr. Chairman?
Yes, she is. Yes, she's still there.
Madam Speaker? I thought she had.
No, she's here.
Oh, okay. Madam Speaker, thank you for your eloquent comments. And I'd like to pose the question that I ended with. And you so aptly know the Chinese, and that is this tension between this huge economic force and what we should value as the ultimate advocacy, and that is human rights, because human rights has few champions. And when I say that in the international arena, when the economy or the size of one's purse becomes relevant, and how do we balance that and advocate in the administration about the need to raise the specter of human rights as it deals with China?
Well, we've been working on this, Mr. Smith, Frank Wolf, others in a bipartisan way over the years. Certainly, Mr. McGovern later, he came a few years later on this subject. Let me just say this: China is a great nation. That is to say, great in terms of size and significance. When we were children, many of us were told if we dug a hole at the beach, we would reach China because they're right on the other side of us. We are connected on this planet. I have been a constant critic of China on human rights, trade, and proliferation of weapons to rogue countries for years. The administration, Democratic and Republican, I'm not presidential, executive branch, have looked the other way at China's violations over time. But China, in terms of this planet, we've had to work together on the climate issue. And we can learn from China, they can learn from us. We need to work together. But we cannot then just say we're going to ignore everything else in our relationship. So they arranged for me to go and speak the first time on the subject of discussing climate issues. But I said, I cannot come unless I can speak out about human rights. You can't expect me to do that. And so where we can, we should be trying to work together, but we cannot, again, ignore what's happening in the South China Sea from a security standpoint, what's happening in terms of trade violations. You aptly mentioned intellectual property. But as Mr. Smith can attest, we have tried everything, and we usually win in the Congress, but we cannot usually override the presidential vetoes that come with this. So it's a hard challenge, but we just have to keep it in front of the American people, but recognizing that where we have common interest, we should strive to work together and hope that that cooperation will lead to further cooperation in other areas. It's just really sad that over time, China has not made the progress on human rights that it has made in some other economic areas in China, but it is also sad to report that President Xi is just taking us backward. He has been really, well, it's we must speak out. When he said to me once when he was here, well, you don't know what's going on in Tibet. Go to Tibet and see for yourself. I said, well, I've been trying to get a visa to go to Tibet for like 20 years. So if you want me to go see for ourselves, then give us the visas, which they did. And we went under leadership of our spiritual leader of our trip, Jim McGovern. We went, and what we saw was a Potemkin village. They just had created a situation that wasn't real, but they wanted us to think that it was. Mr. McGovern fought very hard for there to be a consulate in Lhasa, also to be able to have better access to Tibet for many people. So it's been an ongoing, so when you ask us, it's been a day-to-day ongoing bipartisan effort, but they know that we will be relentless and persistent, and we're not going away. It doesn't seem to have affected their behavior too much, but nonetheless, we will continue. But I think it's really important for us to hear from our witnesses because they have been the ones of courage to speak out. And so many friends that we have in China or have come out of China who've spoken so courageously on all of this. Let's hear from them. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. And I want to thank you for your point that you don't believe in stovepiping human rights, China human rights violations. I asked Secretary Kerry in a hearing just a few days ago on his trip, did he raise the issue of human rights? And he said, I stay in my lane. He was talking about climate, but we really need to, any contact, the business community, the labor community, any diplomatic or other issue needs to say, hey, what you're doing in Xinjiang genocide is the equivalent of what the Nazis did. And what you do to your people, your own people, the Han Chinese, each and every day, is monstrous. And it all goes to the foot of Xi Jinping. I mean, others, Hu Jintao, others were awful on human rights. He's taken it, as you pointed out, to new lows. So we need to be ever present. And I thank you for, it's everybody's lane, not just, a human rights delegation who might go over there to speak. I would point out that we did invite the International Olympic Committee to be here today. We also asked the United States Olympic and Paralympic Committee if they would testify. They have submitted a statement, but it's pretty much like the statement without objection will be made a part of the record to the letter that was sent to every member of Congress. At least that's my understanding. I got one. But it's just based, we need answers. And so I reiterate that request that they come and present their view on this and answer questions. And I thank you, Madam Speaker. Could you unmute the speaker?
They are trying. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I will now go to our second panel, and thank you again, Madam Speaker, for being here. And beginning with Dr. Zhang Li, who is a world-renowned scholar, human rights activist, and architect, and leader for Chinese democracy. He immigrated to the United States following the Tiananmen Square protests in '89. He is the president of the Citizen Power Initiatives for China, which he founded in 2007. He was a prisoner of conscience, a part of the pro-democracy movement, committed to peaceful transition to democracy in China. He firmly believes that it is critical for a peaceful democratic transition in China, that the world democracies continue to hold China accountable for abusing the human rights and political rights of their citizens. We will then hear from Susan Lawrence, who's a specialist in Asian affairs at the Congressional Research Service, where her work focuses on the PRC and Taiwan. Immediately before joining CRS in 2010, Ms. Lawrence managed advocacy campaigns in China as part of a major philanthropic foundation, a global public health initiative early in her career. She worked for a cumulative of 11 years as a Beijing-based bureau chief and staff reporter for major U.S. publications. Then we'll hear from Rehan Assad, who is an attorney, Yale World Fellow, and senior fellow at the Raoul Wallenberg Center for Human Rights. Her brother, Ekbar Assad, a 2016 participant in the State Department's International Visitors Leadership Program, was arrested upon returning to China and is now reportedly serving 15 years in prison for trumped up charges, including ethnic hatred and ethnic discrimination. Rehan is a frequent speaker at international fora and has testified before the parliaments of Canada, the UK, and Lithuania. She has been featured in the New York Times, BBC, CNN, The Hill, The Globe, Daily Mail, among others. Her writing has also been published in many legal journals, and her opinions have appeared in Foreign Policy and in other prominent publications. Then we'll hear from Samuel M. Chu, who is the founding and managing director of the Hong Kong Democracy Council and a nationally recognized organizer for social change and a more democratic world. Mr. Chu was born and raised in Hong Kong and is the younger son of Reverend Chu Yiming, a veteran and leading pro-democracy organizer in Hong Kong. Previously, Mr. Chu was a fellow at the Center for Religion and Civic Culture at the University of Southern California. He was also the founding president of One LA Industrial Areas Foundation, one of the nation's largest broad-based organizing networks, and served as founding executive director of California Faith for Equality and California Faith for Equality Action Fund. We'll then hear from Reggie Littlejohn, who is the founder and president of Women's Rights Without Borders, an international coalition to expose and oppose forced abortion, gendercide, and sexual slavery in China. WRWF is the only organization inside rural China saving babies and abandoned widows. Women's Rights Without Frontiers seeks to form a left-right human rights and humanitarian coalition to end forced abortion and gendercide, the killing of little girls. She is also a graduate of Yale Law School and a litigation attorney, an acclaimed international expert on China's one-child policy. Ms. Littlejohn has testified 8 times before the U.S. Congress, 3 times at the European Parliament, and is presented to the British, Irish, and Canadian parliaments as well. And finally, we'll hear from Sophie Richardson, who is the China director at Human Rights Watch and a longtime friend of the Lantos Commission and the CECC. Dr. Richardson is the author of numerous articles on domestic Chinese political reform, democratization and human rights in Cambodia, China, Indonesia, Hong Kong, and the Philippines, and Vietnam. She has provided commentary to the BBC, CNN, and so many other publications throughout the world. Among her many appearances, she testified before the CECC in 2017 on the broken promises that accompanied China's ascension to the World Trade Organization and the need to reprioritize human rights, a topic which in many ways foreshadows those being explored at today's hearing. We welcome her back to the Congress. I'd like to now ask Dr. Yang if he could present his testimony.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As the world watched, the Chinese government committed gross human rights abuses in the run-up to the 2008 Beijing Olympics. But just before the IOC's final decision in 2015 to choose China for the 2022 Winter Olympics, IOC official Mark Adams said that Beijing had given the IOC new assurances concerning human rights, and that the IOC was confident that the government of China would take all necessary measures to ensure the Olympic Charter. In other words, it's 2008 all over again. Actually, much, much worse. Here we are again. The US is facing a difficult test. There is every reason for the US to stay away from the 2022 Beijing Olympics. We should and we can. Both IOC President Bach and the Chinese leader Xi Jinping are loudly proclaiming that the games should not be politicized. We are all too familiar with what is meant by the politicization of an event. By Xi's definition, any stance on any issue is an act of politicization if he does not like it, period. According to the Olympic Charter, the goal of Olympians concerns harmonious development of humankind and the preservation of human dignity. Genocide is the antithesis of the the development of humankind. And forced labor is not for the preservation of human dignity. The Olympics are bound to be political if these issues are defined to be political. Beijing 2022 will be Xi's games, just as Berlin 1936 were Hitler's. Let's see why this is so. Number one, allowing Beijing to host the games without opposition will serve as tacit approval of the CCP's model of authoritarian capitalism, digital totalitarianism, and rights-free development. Number two, for supporting, attending, and participating in the games, the entire world will become complicit in China's Uyghur genocide and other atrocious crimes against humanity, enabling China to actively promote and globally export its repressive human rights agenda and views. Number three, the games will serve as a de facto international coronation of Xi Jinping, especially recognizing him as leader for life prior to his official coronation 8 months later, when he's set to enter his third term by breaking the previous 2-term limit. Number four, the games will serve as a vehicle to drive Chinese nationalistic fervor, which is a major source of legitimacy for the rule of the CCP, particularly of Xi. Number five, the games will be a propaganda spectacle through which the CCP boasts above its successful containment of COVID-19, economic recovery, harmonious society, ethnic unity, and Xi's wisdom and solution to pave the way towards a happy, prosperous, pandemic-free world. The CCP will not spare a second to try to project to the global audience a soft power which China lacks and is eager to obtain in order to rise on the world stage. If we do not want to be used by Xi Jinping to serve his political agenda, we must send a clear message in opposition. I'm calling on the US and its allies to do the following: initiate a joint political boycott of the 2022 Beijing Winter Olympics, urging businesses and athletes not to participate in the games. And if they do participate, encourage them to find creative ways to express their condemnation of the CCP's crimes against the humanity. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, Dr. Yang. I would like to, we'll save questions obviously till after all the witnesses have spoken. It's now my privilege to recognize Susan Lawrence for such time as she may consume.
Chairman Smith, Chairman McGovern, and Chairman Merkley, thank you and other members in attendance for inviting the Congressional Research Service to testify at today's hearing. I am Susan Lawrence. I'm a specialist in Asian affairs. As you requested, I'll be discussing the role of the Communist Party in China's preparations for the 2022 Winter Olympics, the goals the Communist Party has articulated for the Games, and the Xinjiang region's involvement in preparations for the Games. Beijing is the first city in Olympic history to be selected to host Summer and Winter Olympics. The government of China has vowed that the Games will open in Beijing on time next February, despite the challenges of the pandemic, and despite calls from some in the international community to move the Games out of China to protest China's human rights record. China's state media have presented China's leader, Communist Party General Secretary and State President Xi Jinping, as personally guiding China's planning for the Olympics. A high-level Communist Party body, the Central Leading Group for the Work of the 24th Winter Olympic Games, is overseeing preparations for the Games. The Central Leading Group is headed by Han Zheng, China's 9th most senior official, and a member of the party's top decision-making body, the 9-man Politburo Standing Committee. His two deputies on the Central Leading Group are both members of the 25-member Politburo, the party's second most senior decision-making body. The international facing entity in charge of planning for the Games is the Beijing Organizing Committee for the 2022 Olympic and Paralympic Winter Games, known as BOCOG. It answers to the party's central leading group and is headed by Beijing Party Chief Tsai Chi, who is also a deputy on the central leading group. A review of Xi Jinping's remarks related to the Winter Olympics suggests that he sees Beijing hosting these games as serving at least 5 national purposes. First, Xi has presented the Games as helping to spur progress on one of his signature initiatives, the development of a new megacity in North China. Xi has championed the integrated development of Beijing, the port city of Tianjin, and the province of Hebei, with the goal of creating a new metropolitan area of 130 million people to be known as Jingjinji. To catalyze that vision, China's Olympic planners selected 3 far-flung locations for Olympic venues: central Beijing, Yanqing, an outlying district of Beijing, and Hebei province's Zhangjiakou, a city 125 miles from Beijing. Second, Xi has stated that he sees the Olympics as a means, quote, to stimulate the national spirit, end quote, and to rally, quote, the sons and daughters of China at home and abroad, end quote, to achieve what he calls the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation. The Pentagon characterizes that quest for China's rejuvenation as, quote, a determined pursuit of political and social modernity that includes far-ranging efforts to expand China's national power, perfect its governance systems, and revise the international order, end quote. Third, Xi appears to see hosting the Olympics as an opportunity to showcase the alleged advantages of China's political system. In January, Xi said, for example, that China's construction of Olympic-related infrastructure and rapid training of winter sports athletes reflects, quote, the institutional advantages of being able to focus efforts to do big things, end quote. Fourth, the party appears to see the Games as a means to boost the profile of Chinese brands internationally. BOCOG has so far signed 40 corporate sponsors, almost all of which are based in China. Sponsors include iFly Tech Corporation, exclusive supplier of automated translation software to the Games. The US Department of Commerce's Bureau of Industry and Security added iFly Tech to its entities list in 2019, saying the firm was, quote, implicated in human rights violations and abuses, end quote, in Xinjiang. BOCOG corporate sponsors also include Snickers, a brand of US-based Mars Inc. A separate group of 16 mainly global companies participate in the Olympic Partner Program, known as the TOP Program, and managed by the International Olympic Committee. The TOP Program includes 2 Chinese companies, Alibaba Group and the China Mengniu Dairy Company. It also includes 7 US companies, Airbnb, Coca-Cola, Dow, the General Electric Company, Intel, Procter & Gamble, and Visa. Finally, Xi has stated that he sees the 2022 Olympics as an opportunity to promote winter sports in China. Xinjiang has been a focus for that effort, because unlike most of China, areas of Xinjiang are endowed with plentiful natural snow. China's government has built winter sports facilities to support the Olympics. The Chinese national team athletes have been training in Xinjiang, and local jurisdictions in Xinjiang have been training residents to serve as Beijing 2022 Winter Olympics volunteers. To conclude, China's leader Xi Jinping has associated himself closely with the 2022 Beijing Winter Olympics. He appears to view hosting the Games as an important part of his vision for achieving what he calls China's national rejuvenation, and as an opportunity to promote China's system of governance and its economy on a global stage. Authorities in distant Xinjiang appear to have expended significant effort to support the Games, even as those same authorities were undertaking a program of mass internment and re-education of ethnic and religious minorities that has drawn global condemnation. Thank you, and I welcome your questions.
Ms. Lawrence, thank you very much for those insights and that incisive testimony. I'd like to now yield to Rehan Assad.
Good afternoon, esteemed members of Congress and co-panelists, and especially thank you, Congressman Chris Smith, for your advocacy for my brother. I appear before you today as a human rights lawyer and a sister to a victim of the Chinese government's 21st century prison camps, Akbar Assad. I recall 2008, when China hosted the Olympics. I was a young college student in Wuhan, among the few Uyghurs studying there. My friends and I got up early to watch the Olympic torch relay, a historic and glorious moment for China. We in China the time, were totally unaware of the discussion taking place outside about China's human rights abuses and support of the Sudanese government's state-sponsored violence in Darfur. But not every Uyghur was lucky enough to live a normal life. In Beijing, authorities cleaned up for the games by expelling many Uyghurs who were living there. Soon after, I left China to study in Canada, then later at Harvard, before I made the US as my permanent home. I also worked in Turkey. I used to visit my family regularly until the spring of 2016, when China declared a people's war on its own people, the Uyghurs. Before the Uyghur crisis began, I was just like many other Americans who are living their lives, exploring the world, and contributing to our society in different ways. All my life, I believed in building bridges just as my brother Ahmed did. Growing up in Xinjiang, I wanted to work not only for the prosperity of my own region, but of the whole country. Like many other Uyghurs, I was a model citizen, and my parents were my role models. I was serious about it. I organized the very first Turkey-China conference in hopes that China would recognize what great ambassadors we Uyghurs could be to the rest of the Turkic world. I believe China was making progress despite its deep flaws, and the Uyghurs would be at the center of the country's bright future. My brother and I were the very sort of citizens CCP propaganda claimed to valorize, but in the end, that was no protection. I learned the hard way that as long as we're born Uyghurs, persecution always looms. My brother Ahmed is a tech entrepreneur, media founder, philanthropist. Before having his life torn away for excelling while Uyghur, he was a tireless peace builder. His entrepreneurship and philanthropy landed him recognition within China and abroad. Chinese media outlets extolled him as a star in a tech world, a positive force for humanity, and a bridge builder. However, even Akbar could not escape the Chinese government's prison camps, the largest mass ethnic detention since World War II. Immediately, as Congressman mentioned, returning from the State Department's program, he was brutally imprisoned, and that was spring 2016. I have learned that my brother has been held and continues to be held in torture by solitary confinement in Aksu, far from home, since January 2019. Perhaps due to my consistent advocacy over the past year, 2 months ago, the authorities granted a 3-minute video call to my family. And if the party thinks that I would shut up over a video, they gravely miscalculated. They didn't show me my brother healthy, well cared for, or even totally present. They couldn't hide how gone he was, how broken. The phrase shadow of his former self took a new, horrifyingly literal meaning for me. In the past 5 years, no matter how excruciating life has been for the Uyghurs and other Turkic ethnic communities, they have exemplified and endured what it means to be resilient and peaceful in the face of hatred, cruelty, and dehumanization of genocide. Today, we're gathered to debate whether China should host the Olympics while committing horrific crimes against humanity. The International Olympic Committee once banned the South African apartheid government, but today fails to uphold the same principles. Olympic values and even basic moral accountability stop at superpower, as it seems. As each day passes, life is being lost in these camps. Human dignity suffers. Families are separated, and innocent children are raised without their parents embrace their language or their culture. So today, my recommendation as an attorney reflects how our actions will directly affect the victims and follows what I believe to be the best path to mitigating and ending this unspeakable human suffering. Even though it appears we're in a bind with no good option, we have actually been presented with 2 opportunities. If we move the games or do not participate, we send a strong signal to the world. And if we do choose to participate, we will have leverage to demand the Chinese government to free the innocent people and close the mass prison camps. This requires a united effort from democracies in the world. International pressure made the International Olympic Committee take a position against the South African apartheid state. The same can and must be done for China. When the Olympics stood up against apartheid, apartheid fell. It is not too late for them to change the course. If this good faith effort fails and the Chinese government remains undeterred to cease this repression, a diplomatic boycott should be exercised. I appreciate and respect the athletes' right to compete. I don't want to take away their chance to accomplish what they've trained for all their lives. What I do suggest, though, is to be given an opportunity to have a face-to-face exchange with the athletes. It will be important for them to know what's going on in China, to hear Akbar's audio from my own words. It's a fine White House tradition to host athletes. I hope the Biden administration can create a space for a dialogue between advocates, family members, and athletes about the ways to achieve the desired goal of all parties and concerned stakeholders. The athletes who are pursuing their lives more energetically than nearly everyone else speak up for the Uyghurs, Kazakhs, and others who had their lives ripped away from them. American athletes should speak up for Akbar, who dared to work for friendships between the United States and China. Every day when my brother and other victims suffer and waste away, our dignity as bystanders drains away with their fears. At the end of this genocide, when the world is looking on the remains of Uyghur society, it will ask itself why it didn't do more to help. The world will feel itself to be less than it was, having lost its own dignity within the horror. So I implore you and all those who are tuning in, refuse to have your own dignity stolen. Stand up, demand an end to this genocide before it's too late. Thank you. I yield back.
Rehan, thank you so very much for that powerful testimony. Your brother and the Uyghurs in general have no better advocate. So thank you, and for your advice and suggestions. I'd like to now recognize Reggie Littlejohn, the founder and president of Women's Rights Without Frontiers.
Thank you, Chairman Smith and Madam Speaker Pelosi and all of the chairs and co-chairs of the Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission and the Congressional Executive Commission on China. In 1936, the Olympic Games were held in Berlin, Germany, and predictably, they proved to be an enormous propaganda windfall for Adolf Hitler's Third Reich, affording it unwarranted and unparalleled international prestige, legitimacy, and credibility. Arguably, these benefits served as a smokescreen to hide the terrific crimes against humanity and genocide that were unleashed by the Third Reich. Today, we are confronting another totalitarian regime actively engaged in another genocide, and we must not make this mistake again of allowing a genocidal regime to glory in hosting the world's most prestigious international event. And indeed, as a signatory of the Genocide Convention of 1948, the United States cannot allow this to happen, along with the other more than 150 signatories to this convention. The Chinese Communist Party is committing genocide against ethnic minorities in Xinjiang. So the designation of genocide by Secretary of State Pompeo and affirmed by new Secretary of State Blinken is important, that it's genocide as opposed to simply a crime against humanity. And this is something that I want to focus on today, because the fact that we are signatories or contracting parties to the Genocide Convention gives us certain responsibilities as well as remedies that we would not have if this is not genocide, but merely a crime against humanity. So when Secretary Pompeo issued his genocide determination, he focused on the many crimes against the Uyghurs, including widespread arbitrary imprisonment, forced abortion, forced sterilization, forced labor, draconian restrictions on freedom of religion, and torture. And he concluded, we are witnessing the systematic attempt to destroy the Uyghurs by the Chinese party state. Now, under the Genocide Convention of 1948 and the Rome Statute, and they have the same text, right? This is what constitutes genocide. Genocide means any of the following acts committed with intent to destroy in whole or in part a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group, such as killing the members of the group, causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group, deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part, imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group, forcibly transferring children of the group to another group. So we've heard testimony about all of these. This situation is unique because the CCP is not committing just one, but all 5, any one of which would be sufficient for a genocide determination. But I want to just highlight one, which is the causing of serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group. There was a BBC report that came out from an escapee from one of the camps, and she said that she witnessed that the rape of a young woman, maybe 20 or 22 years old, in front of 100 of the female inmates of the camp. And not only were they gang raping this young woman, but they were looking at the faces of the women who were observing it to see if anybody flinched, if anybody cried, if anybody looked away. And if they did, then they would be punished as well. I just can't imagine anything that is more designed to inflict mental harm and really crush the spirit of someone. So there has been some dispute as to whether the CCP has exhibited the intent to destroy, which is an important part of the definition of genocide. I argue that they have. According to Secretary Pompeo's genocide determination, quote, the Chinese Communist Party apparatchiks are delivering a far darker message to their own people, portraying Uyghurs as, quote, malignant tumors, end quote, comparing their faith to a communicable plague, and exhorting the party faithful to implement a crushing blow, telling them you can't uproot all the weeds hidden among the crops in the field one by one. You need to spray chemicals to kill them all. So I would say that constitutes an intent to commit genocide. And second, genocidal intent need not be stated. It is more often inferred from a systematic pattern of coordinated acts. So, for example, against the Uyghurs, there has been it is undeniable that while China has scrapped or reduced its one-child policy in the rest of China, that it has been upping the forced abortions and forced sterilizations of Uyghurs to the extent that the Uyghurs population increased. The births dropped almost 49% in Xinjiang between 2017 and 2019. That's almost a 50% drop. Okay, you can infer from that, even if they don't say we're trying to stop them or we're trying to kill them, that is in fact what they are doing. So whether or not the CCP's acts against the Uyghurs are crimes against humanity or genocide is more than a difference in semantic. The fact that these acts constitute genocide brings into effect the requirements and the remedies of the Genocide Convention. Specifically, Article 1 of the Convention states, the contracting parties confirm that genocide, whether committed in time of peace or time of war, is a crime under international law which they undertake to prevent and to punish. So we have signed that along with 150 other countries. Does our signature on the Genocide Convention have teeth? Do we really mean it when we say never again? So we have to prevent genocide, and we have to punish them. So I think that moving the Olympics, which would be my first choice, would be a way of punishing them. I really do think that all 152 signatories of the Genocide Convention should come together and with one voice and say we need to move the Olympics. We are obligated to ask for this, and there needs to be a city that will step up to the plate for this. And, so that I call upon cities with the infrastructure for the Winter Olympics to step up to the plate and offer to host them. And then beyond that, if this is genocide, then then we have the remedies that we can exercise. And I have written these remedies out under the Genocide Convention in my written testimony, and I will be happy to answer them, to talk about them in the questions and answers, because we don't have a lot of time for this opening statement. But I would like to say that on April 15th of 2021, the CPDC, the Congressional, the Committee on the Present Danger of China, Women's Rights Without Frontiers, together spearheaded this letter, which was signed by 110 dignitaries and human rights activists, public policy, national security folks, asking that the Olympics be moved or boycotted. And I asked that this letter would be entered into the congressional record.
That objection so ordered.
Okay, so we didn't, thank you, Chairman Smith. We did not receive a direct answer to that letter from the United States Olympic Committee and Paralympic Committee, but we did receive but Susan Hirschland, as you know, CEO of the USOPC, sent a letter to Congress basically saying they don't want to move or boycott the Olympics because it's not fair to the athletes. This assertion ignores the fact that the human rights in China have seriously deteriorated since the 2008 Olympics, okay? And also, it ignores the fact that the signatories of the Genocide Convention are obligated to prevent and punish genocide. So I don't really think that we have a whole lot of choice. We have to either withdraw our signature or prevent and punish the genocide. I would go further. I would say that China should be banned from participation in the Olympics. South Africa was banned from the Olympics from 1964 to 1988 because of its practice of apartheid. Likewise, the International Olympics Committee should express disapproval of the CCP's genocide by banning China from the Olympics. And finally, I would go so far as to say that I think that that Congress should consider designating China as a transnational criminal organization. We have been talking about the internal genocide and other human rights atrocities of the Chinese Communist Party to its own people. But what about what they've done internationally? What about the way that they unleashed the coronavirus upon the world? What about the way that they're flooding our shores with fentanyl? What about the countless billions and billions of dollars that they're stealing from us in intellectual property? They should be designated as a transnational criminal organization and should not be honored by being the hosts of the Olympics. Our athletes deserve to compete on soil that is not stained by the blood of genocide. Thank you.
Now? Oh, yeah. Thank you very much, Ms. Littlejohn, for that testimony. Thank you for your decades of work to expose and combat gendercide, the deliberate and systematic extermination of the girl child in China, but elsewhere, through sex-selected abortion. It has been extraordinary and so much needed. They have so few advocates around the world, and yet these little girls, I mean, the missing girls in China, as we all know, has exacerbated the human trafficking situation in China because they simply don't exist. Because they have been killed through sex-selected abortion. So thank you for that work as well. And I would hope that during questions you would get into some of the remedies that you think need to be done. I'd like to now introduce Samuel Chu and recognize him for such time as he may consume.
Good afternoon, and thank you, Chair Smith, and thank you, chairs and co-chairs, Mr. Merkley, Mr. Smith, Mr. McGovern, for hosting this hearing, and for commissioners of both the Lantos Human Rights Commissions and the Congressional Executive Commission for China for the opportunity for me to contribute to the work that you're doing in support of Hong Kong and China, human rights in Hong Kong and China. Let me just begin. I want to start by saying that freedom-loving Hong Kongers stand with our Uyghur brothers and sisters, with you, Rayhan, with your brother. If genocide does not stop us in our tracks and spur us to meaningful action in response to the Olympics and beyond, nothing else will, and shame on all of us. Like many kids who grew up in Hong Kong, I played table tennis when I was growing up, or we call it ping pong. Like American kids who first picked up a basketball or learned tumbling in gymnastics or laced up their first pair of skates, I fantasized about one day competing at the Olympics. Now, my ping pong career never took off, but it didn't diminish the pride of watching athletes from Hong Kong competing in the Olympics, or my daydreams about what it would be like to stand on the podium. But my dream was only possible because Hong Kong fielded its own teams for the Olympics, separate from the United Kingdom prior to '97, and then later separate from the People's Republic of China. I remember asking my parents if we would still have our own team after 1997 and the handover. And they reassured me that Hong Kong would still be separate and distinct on the sports fields because it was enshrined in Hong Kong's basic law that we would maintain and develop relationships, including in the appropriate fields of economic, trade, financial and monetary, shipping, communications, cultural, and sports. And I remember being relieved that our flag would still be there. At the time, it was a childish question and a minute detail, but for Hong Kong to be able to march under its own flag was an important symbol of the guarantees of freedoms and autonomy under one country, two systems. Today, that small footnote is the only remaining remnant among the broken promises China made to Hong Kong and to the world. The fall of Hong Kong has been swift and total. The national security law unilaterally imposed a year ago has been used aggressively to crush freedom of speech, to purge all political oppositions, and to sever the pro-democracy movement's tie to the international community. Not satisfied with the mass disqualifications of pro-democracy candidates and lawmakers or the postponement of elections, last month, the CCP fundamentally altered the election system and the makeup of the Hong Kong Legislative Council to ensure that it is only staffed with Beijing loyalists. Every public face of the pro-democracy movement is now either in jail, living in exile, or living in de facto political house arrest without their political rights and any right to engage publicly. 2 years ago, last week, CECC actually heard from a delegation of Hong Kongers. Martin Lee, the founding father of democracy, now convicted, sentenced. Lee Cheuk-yan, the top labor leader in Hong Kong, convicted and jailed. Nathan Law, the youngest legislator ever elected in Hong Kong, now live in exile in the United Kingdom. The list goes on. Jimmy Lai, the media tycoon and publisher of the opposition paper Apple Daily, Joshua Wong, whom many of you nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize, have both been relentlessly and serially prosecuted to ensure that they remain behind bars indefinitely. Last month, Bao Choi, an award-winning journalist who investigated one of the most brutal attacks on peaceful protesters on July 21st, 2019, became the first reporter in Hong Kong to be convicted for simply finding out the truth. And weeks later, her programs and other programmings were erased and deleted from the outlet that she reported for. There have been blocking of websites. From June 2019 to July 2020, the government made over 1,400 requests for personal data to tech companies like Apple, Google, Facebook, and Twitter. Activists have now been charged solely based on what they wrote or posted on social media. All of this has taken place and unfolded in plain sight. No one can claim that we didn't know this was happening before they set foot on Chinese snow next year. And allowing Beijing to become the first ever city to host both Summer and Winter Olympics would be making the wrong kind of history. But we've been here before. In 2001, to secure the rights of the 2008 Games, the Chinese government made promises to improve human rights, press freedoms, treatment of dissidents, internet censorship. They not only broke those promises, they have doubled down on those repressions and exported it beyond its border. And by failing to hold them accountable, the International Olympic Committee has effectively told the regime that they can do whatever without the fear of repercussions and sanctions. The IOC's pretext in repeatedly awarding the games to repressive regime has always been that it would lessen their abuse if they were awarded the games. Let me tell you, Hong Kongers are uniquely trained and credentialed to refute this line of magical thinking. The British government handed over Hong Kong to China with this same wishful thinking that it would open up the country. The US has been here before too. Let's grant China the most favored nation status and membership into the World Trade Organization without conditions, because we believe magically that free trade would inevitably lead to human rights. Fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice, shame on me. And fool me thrice, the IOC is probably in on the con. As many of you and members of Congress received a letter from Sarah Hirshland, CEO of the U.S. Olympic and Paralympic Committee, where she said explicitly that the games are not the solution to geopolitical issues. The reality is that hosting the Olympic is now the go-to proven solution for authoritarian regime to whitewash their crimes, boost their international image, and strengthen their alliances. And worse, China has used the 2008 Olympics as a catalyst for expanding its security and surveillance apparatus domestically. China should have been banned from hosting all major sports events then. In 2019, the World Anti-Doping Agency banned Russia from playing and hosting all major sporting events for 4 years, later reduced to 2, including the Olympics, because of doping violations. Russia, for the crime of doping, is banned from the games hosted by a regime committing crimes against humanity. Let that sink in. If a 2-year ban is a justified punishment for doping, what is justified for the taking of the lives and freedom of 13 million ethnic minorities in Xinjiang and East Turkestan and the 7.5 million Hong Kongers? The IOC must do what they refused to do before. Ban China from playing and hosting all Olympics indefinitely. Let individual Chinese athletes compete as neutral athletes. Their uniform may not bear the Chinese flag, and the Chinese national anthem should not be played or sung at any official event venue. At the very minimum, the same penalties that Russia received. I want to make clear that we should not ask individual athletes to bear our burden. It would be unfair to outsource our moral obligation to a small group of young athletes. But neither should we let people who have a choice, who hold the power, who are reaping the financial benefits, off the hook. The windfall of Olympics, in any Olympic, is in sponsorship and advertising. So for the corporations who are willingly broadcasting their affiliation, the international and local Olympic committees who are eagerly taking their cut of the profits, we have to call every one of them to account. Every member of the International Olympic Committees, of the Executive Board, of the Financial Committee, especially American members, the paid lobbyists for the International Olympic Committee, every member of the US Olympic and Paralympic Committee, and every executive and board members of corporations sponsoring and companies providing goods and service for the game. Unlike the athletes, they had made a choice. And it is up to us to exact a real, painful, lasting cost for companies reaping those financial benefits while ignoring the gross human rights abuses. And for the IOC to think twice before ever accepting a bid from an authoritarian regime again. Hong Kongers and HKDC have been consistently calling for coordinated actions among 3 nations against the CCP abuses and repression. But tangible steps and results have been elusive. What if there was a lever readily available? A global platform that would focus the spotlight on the CCP and its crimes, and a way to apply unprecedented political and economic pressure based solely on our collective will to act. The Olympic is that lever. And the actions that we decide to take together for the 2022 games may not change the CCP's behavior immediately, but it will be consequential in determining our power and ability to push back on the Chinese regime moving forward. In 1996, the year I became a naturalized US citizen, the Summer Games took place in Atlanta. That year, the Hong Kong team, competing under its own flag, won its only and first gold medal. It wasn't in ping pong, it was in sailing. It was also the last medal that Hong Kong would win in the games as Team Hong Kong before it became Hong Kong, China. But that, in the larger scheme of things, is just a minor detail. The Olympic Games are about something much bigger. The ideals and values of the Olympic movement cannot be achieved or won on the playing field. They can only be realized when they become tangible, lasting, and shared realities for everyone off the field. So let's make the Olympics about the bigger things. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chu, for that very, very eloquent statement as well. And for that idea that progress may not be immediate, but it would be consequential. I think that is very profound, as well as other things that you said. I'd like to now introduce Dr. Sophie Richardson and recognize her and welcome her back.
Thank you very much, Chairman Smith, Chairman McGovern, Chairman Merkley. It's great to be with you this afternoon. Thanks for inviting us to join. Partly because I can't possibly improve on all of the history and a lot of the analysis that my fellow panelists have provided. I'm going to try to spend my time focused on recommendations. I hope that's acceptable to you.
Sure.
To really explore how in this environment, or what in this environment, the IOC, sponsors, governments, legislators, and athletes can actually do in and around the 2022 Beijing Olympics. So I'd like to offer the following thoughts. First, for governments. Human Rights Watch does support a diplomatic boycott of the 2022 Games. No senior officials should attend. Athletes can and should be celebrated, but that can be done in their home countries prior to their departure and after their return. I do, however, want to give a shout out to an excellent campaign that was launched yesterday called Boycott Beijing 2022, in which I think some of our closest friends make some very compelling arguments for the position that they're offering up. You know, we would much rather that US government officials were spending time doing things like figuring out how to challenge the Chinese government's sense of impunity for human rights crimes than in figuring out how to get diplomats back and forth or high-ranking officials back and forth to the Beijing Games. That's a much better use, we think, of human rights energy. Second, governments have to be prepared to deal with and defend their athletes' rights to express their views in ways that may irk Chinese authorities or run into other kinds of problems. We think this is going to be a much more serious consular matter than it was last time around. And that may include state surveillance of private communications of athletes, coaches, or support staff, or even the arbitrary collection of biodata. I think the US government has to be prepared for that. And then last but not least, governments should be briefing athletes and those who are going to the games on the Chinese government's human rights records and practices such that they're fully informed. Those are, we think, real priorities for governments. As for the IOC, while the IOC has made many new human rights related commitments, the clearest ones were adopted after Beijing was awarded the 2022 Games, such that both the IOC and Beijing believe that those standards cannot be applied to the 2022 Games. But the IOC has made clear that it has no intention of carrying out human rights due diligence, a corporate responsibility enshrined in the 2011 United Nations Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights to assess business operations and supply chains, leaving it vulnerable to everything from using forced labor-made goods in Olympics branded products, but also in failing to think through, we think, important ethical or moral aspects of the games. We all recall, I think, cringing in 2008 when the Chinese government and the IOC agreed to run the torch through Lhasa. What are they going to do this time? Run it through Urumqi? There's no real indication that the IOC has even thought this through. or prepared to push back, lest the Chinese government propose that. And I'd like to echo something that Mr. Govern said in his opening remarks, that if Tokyo can get postponed because of public health concerns, surely Beijing can be rethought over crimes against humanity. As for the sponsors and broadcasters, the top sponsors of the Olympics and the networks that broadcast the 2022 Games, which includes NBC, should be pressed immediately to carry out the same kind of human rights due diligence as it pertains to their sponsorship. Few of these companies have shown any public concern for becoming complicit in human rights violations and have repeatedly recently responded to journalists' queries on this topic with, quote, "no comment. We cannot urge you strongly enough to call these companies before your commissions and committee to ask similar questions where presumably no comment is not really one of the possible answers. These companies shouldn't want to profit from repression, yet they seem unwilling to confront the reality they might just be doing so. I can tell you that in my 15 years at Human Rights Watch, I have been called by more companies since the beginning of this year than in those previous years combined, all privately asking whether they can do business ethically, even if their supply chains run through Xinjiang, or if they are operating the technology industry. And we offer a pretty blunt reply to that question. For the athletes, Human Rights Watch supports the athletes' opportunity to participate in these games. They are not responsible either for the IOC's awarding the games to the Chinese government or for that government's human rights record. Nevertheless, particularly in this time of highly effective activism by athletes in support of human rights and social justice, we strongly believe that athletes will benefit from briefings to be fully informed about the human rights environment and be supported by their governments and their national Olympic committees in sharing their views. And then last but not least, for Congress, which has produced the most extraordinary slew of bipartisan legislation on human rights issues across and beyond China in the last couple of years, it's been dizzying and a bit difficult to keep up with, but it's been wonderful to see. I think the only addition we can possibly make to your to-do list is to find ways to work with like-minded allies in parliaments around the world. There are many governments whose legislators are having very similar conversations, and we believe that that kind of coordinated activism can help press governments to take stronger policies in support of human rights. This could be on everything from the Olympics to human rights due diligence by sponsors from those other countries to holding Chinese government officials accountable for crimes against humanity. We think it's clear that the Chinese government's intensifying crackdown undermines the basic rights that are essential for the human spirit of the Olympics. The IOC's failure to publicly confront Beijing's serious human rights violations makes a mockery of its own commitments and claims that the Olympics are, quote, a force for good. But there are still opportunities to press for human rights gains, to improve corporate responsibility with respect to human rights due diligence, to protect civil society, and to raise awareness. Human Rights Watch hopes that there will be healthy competition among all participants for gold medals in those arenas. Thank you. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you so very much. Dr. Richardson, it's great to have you back again. I'd like to now, Senator Merkley has a vote, we're told, and needs to leave shortly. So I'd like to yield to my friend and colleague for any questions you might have.
Thank you very much, and thank you for that testimony from everyone. I'm going to try to move very quickly here in the interest of everyone's opportunity. But Dr. Zhang Li, I wanted to start with you, and you had noted that in 2015, the IOC had assurances concerning human rights. Do those assurances, which have not been fulfilled, create a foundation for the Olympic Committee to reconvene and reconsider holding the 2022 Olympics in China? And sir, you are muted right now. A mistake we all make every day.
Hello. Yeah.
Yes.
In choosing China for 2022 Winter Olympic in 2015, the IOC seems not to care or just trust either or both. China's promise again. We remember China was awarded to host 2008 Olympics. The international community did that in the hope that the human rights will be improved as a result. But as world watched, and the Chinese government committed gross human rights violations in the run-up to the games and after. But IOC, when they consider the 2022 Olympics, even though they received assurance from China about human rights, concerning human rights, but they never made that public. So in my written public, I urged all the concerned party to ask IOC to make the public what actually China promised this time around. And also the major part of the contract, which concerned how China will make sure to have better games than 2008, it's also sealed from the public. So I think we should ask IOC about the information to press for the transparency.
Thank you very much. I do feel that we should have complete transparency on those assurances, and those assurances, I think, create a foundation for the IOC to be held accountable for reconsidering hosting. I want to turn, if I could, to Ms. Rehan Assad. Thank you for your powerful testimony. Reggie Littlejohn, when she was talking about the Genocide Convention, cited for us Article 2 on the different conditions that exist, that any one of which could be a foundation for a genocide determination. And I wanted to just go through that list and get your sense of whether these things have happened in terms of China's treatment of the Uyghur community. And the first was killing members of the group. Has that happened?
Yes, actually, there are about like 50 legal experts as well as regional experts recently produced a report detailing the horrific crimes that are taking place. There was a mass deaths took place in just one camp alone. So I think it's incumbent upon us understanding the incredibly intrusive surveillance the Chinese government deployed to understand the depths of destruction that has taken place.
I'm just going to go through this whole list very quickly. Second foundation for genocide, causing seriously bodily or mental harm to members of the group. I believe that has happened enormously, but I wanted to ask you that.
Yes, indeed.
The third is deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about physical destruction in whole or in part.
Absolutely.
The fourth is imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group.
Yeah, the Jamestown Foundation did a wonderful report that exactly supports this argument that Uyghur births plummeted over the past few years.
And the sixth is forcibly transferring children of the group to another group.
Yeah, Amnesty International documented that at least 500,000 children are separated in state orphan schools, like some may call residential schools, are being raised under technically state care, but we know what that does mean.
And can we reasonably conclude that these acts were committed with the intent to destroy in whole or in part a national, ethnic, racial, or religious group?
Yeah, when we look at how the Chinese government, and some may argue that this kind of gross human rights abuses took place, but let's look at the facts. These atrocious crimes took place against a particular ethnic groups, Uyghurs and Kazakh and other Turkic ethnic groups. And second, if we look at the Chinese government's own words to break their lineage, break their connection, break their roots, break their regions, and absolutely no mercy, and the language they use to dehumanize people, comparing their religion to tumor and mental disease, all of that, if you look at the totality of the actions, words, the government's directives, and as well as the guidelines to maintain and operate these camps, the government's intention, to me as an attorney, would make it very clear based on the categories that this specific genocide convention outlined as such.
Thank you very much, Ms. Assad. It's clear China has committed genocide, and as determined by the former Secretary of State, the current Secretary of State, certainly by observers around the world, and not just on one foundation, but on every foundation in the Genocide Convention, which gives considerable responsibility to the United States as a member of the Genocide Convention. I want to note Samuel Chu's point that Russia was banned for doping. Shouldn't the penalties for genocide be extraordinarily greater? I also really appreciate the list of ideas presented today. I feel like we should absolutely demand the Olympic Committee to meet and to plan an alternative for holding the games in China. I feel that the point made about athletes that they should be able to compete this was not of their doing, but certainly all of us as actors have choices. Diplomatic boycott. Certainly the sponsors, as pointed out in the final testimony, have made a choice and need to be held accountable and change their sponsorships. Certainly, even at this late date, the games could be dispersed across nations to hold in different parts and different places among nations that honor human rights. I think back to the point that one of the congressmen made at the beginning about what happened in the years of 1936 with the Olympics being held in Germany, following all the horrific actions that had happened in 1933 and 1934. Aren't we now, almost a century later, in a place to really rally the world to say this is 1,000% unacceptable, and that we have to stand against genocide and abuse of human rights everywhere, and these Olympic Games need to be moved. The sponsors need to unsponsor, the diplomats need to not attend, and a combination of these actions need to be put into a coherent plan and implemented. Thank you very much, all of you, for your powerful testimony, and to my fellow colleagues and the two commissions.
Thank you, Senator. I'd like to ask some questions of our very distinguished witnesses, especially thank them for just tremendous testimony, bold, incisive, and very, very informative. Let me ask first, Dr. Yang, exactly what assurances regarding human rights did the IOC get? Has any of that been published? When we invited the IOC to testify, that's one of the questions I, and I'm sure others would have wanted have asked. So the door is open. If they want to come and testify, anytime, any place, we'll do it. And it goes as well for the U.S. affiliate as well. We want them to come and give an account. There's just too much at stake here. One of the submissions and testimony from David Crane, a former assistant secretary, he asked the question, is the modern international Olympic movement creating human rights violations and coddling to dictators, tyrants, and thugs? The answer, sadly, is yes. Just look at the upcoming Winter Olympics in China in 2022. David and so many others have been, and I myself and others on this who are on our commission have been speaking out on this. Yogi Berra once said, "Deja vu all over again." In 2008, we opposed the Olympics. I did it very vigorously. I know my good friend from Human Rights Watch did the same thing, Sophie Richardson. As a matter of fact, I remember you guys put out a press release in 2001 that said, now it's up to the sponsors. That is to say, the big corporations, and did they ever let us down with regards to that? But now, as if none of the lessons were learned, we're going through this again. And I would ask our distinguished witnesses, what if little or nothing is done? It seems to me that if in the face of all of this evidence, Xi Jinping who ought to be at the Hague for crimes against humanity. And I would note parenthetically that we all know that China has signed the Convention on Genocide, April 1983. And of course, the criteria that is listed, articulated in that convention, is being abused, every one of them, by the Chinese government. So on all 5 of the criteria, there it is. They're doing it, and they're doing it on steroids. They took out a reservation on Article 9, which would allow the bringing of an action to the International Court of Justice. So in typical Communist Party methodology, they sign this, and then one of the most important means of enforcement, they take out a reservation. It's just, when are we going to learn? It's very, very, and to the people who are suffering in the gulags, the Laogai, and elsewhere, they must wonder why there's such gullibility on the part of the international community. So, what if little or nothing is done? Let me ask you, if you would, is there any evidence that China is putting pressure on U.S. and or multinational corporations? Are they being asked, told that as a precondition for continuing their big money-making schemes in China, that they need to toe the line? Does anybody have any evidence on that? It's something we need to be looking out for. Ms. Lawrence, you talked about iFlyTech and the fact that they're on the entities list. So they've already been found to be in violation and complicit in the genocide, and yet they're one of those that are intimately involved with the 2022 Olympics. Are there other corporations, Chinese corporations, for example, that are also complicit? And again, our athletes unwittingly will then be, whether they use the services of iFlyTech or someone else, being made a party to this genocide. Maybe you could answer that. The idea of the athletes speaking out, where would they speak out? If they speak out in their home countries, like the United States, will they be penalized once they get there? But most importantly, can they speak out when they get to Beijing? I was with Frank Wolf on another trip to China once in the 1990s. And in our van, we made a phone call back to Pastor Bob Fu, and said that we might go to Tiananmen Square and unfurl a banner that talks about human rights. Our embassy got a call within 20 minutes saying, if we show that kind of demonstration, we will be immediately taken to the airport and thrown out of the country. What possibly could an athlete do when talking to members of the press or anyone else in China without risking expulsion or worse while they're in the theater, at the venue of the Olympics? It really puts them at risk. That how can they possibly speak out? So maybe you want to speak to that. And then Ms. Assat, what has been the response of the U.S. Department of State to your, the fact that your brother, upon returning, was immediately arrested, given 15 years in prison, harshly, as you pointed out. When you saw that video, you were heartbroken over how he has been mistreated, and yet he was part of the International Visitors Leadership Program for the U.S. Department of State. Have they spoken out on his behalf? And again, I would say to our own State Department, we have members of the Radio Free Asia who have had whole large segments of their families rounded up and thrown into the concentration camps, as are other family members. It's one of the other more heinous parts of this terrible cruelty of genocide. Whole families being arrested, tortured, and again, in violation of the Genocide Convention, their children stolen from them and put into a non-Uyghur setting to try to culturally indoctrinate them away from what they are, and that is Uyghurs or Kazakhs or whatever. So some of my first questions, and then, but big business, you might want to speak to that. Do we have any evidence of again, they being pressured, or is the pressure coming from them to make money? I'll just give one final little thought. On one trip to China in the 1990s, I met with the Beijing Chamber of Commerce, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce in Beijing, large group of corporations. Every one of them was telling me how if we just trade more, China will matriculate from a dictatorship to a democracy and that they are on the vanguard of bringing reform. I said I beg to differ, and I gave all my reasons why. And surely they've been proven to be maybe naive, unwittingly complicit, or maybe complicit by design. But no matter what, they've made a lot of money. But now, all these years later, we know beyond any reasonable doubt this is a cruel dictatorship that wants to kill, maim, and destroy and expand their power. So if you could answer those questions, I would appreciate it. Dr. Yang, maybe you first.
Yes, I still want to talk about IOC. And if IOC is serious about producing a better outcome in 2022 than it did in 2008, it must make public its evaluation of Beijing's performance on human rights last time around. But remember, the IOC's report after 2008 said merely that to those who have criticized the IOC on human rights issues, one can argue that the Games have elevated international dialogue on such issues among governments, world leaders, politicians, NGOs, and pressure groups. That is a big lie. I just want to say this because this is just another example why Chinese leaders always get new lessons to act with impunity. So this is what IOC did, but this is an example, I think, to show how usually the international community, corporation, politicians react to the situation in China. Before I forget, I urge all the concerned parties to ask IOC another question, which is very, very important and relevant. We all know China responded to the COVID-19 epidemic by covering up its outbreak, cracking down on whistleblowers, falsifying casualty data, and misleading the whole world. My question is, how can the IOC guarantee China's transparency if another wave of the pandemic breaks out in China during the Games, which will last 8 weeks? So this is possible. So this concerns the safety of athletes and all other participants. So I think for this reason alone, we should make sure how IOC has made a decision, how IOC guarantee China's transparency. If IOC cannot have such a guarantee, we must have different ideas where we should hold Olympics and come up with other strategies to show our opposition.
Thank you. Rayan?
Thank you, Congressman. I do trust that the State Department is doing everything it can to secure my brother's freedom. In fact, last week, I had the tremendous honor to meet with the U.S. mission to the UN, Ambassador Linda Thomas-Greenfield, and at her UN speech, she emphasized my brother's ordeal. So for that, I'm very much grateful. But I like yourself, I would also like to call on the State Department to intensify its effort to make sure that it is a matter of top priority for them. Because, I think it's important that we need to protect the participants of our fine programs so that, other participants from other parts of the world would be encouraged after learning these kind of horrible news to come on to our programs. And if you do allow me, I think corporate sponsorship is one thing that it deeply troubles me in this, and I would like to very quickly comment on that. Whatever measures we decide to take, it's already clear that corporations will stand in the way of what's right. Sponsors of Beijing 22 include Coca-Cola, which lobbied against the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act in order to protect its supplies, and Airbnb, which allows Chinese listings to ban Uyghur renters. Americans' vested interest here, and to all the corporations, is to be on the right side of the history and uphold the US law. Coca-Cola, despite its commendable opposition to controversial voting laws in the United States, cannot express the same solidarity with the victims of concentration camps who are dehumanized, tortured, sterilized, and forcibly disappeared. And no corporate profit margin can ever be allowed to come before our very survival and dignity. So I hope we can continue to demand these companies to be consistent, because you cannot say that I espouse those values of promoting racial equity, but then you choose to look the other way when there's a financial cost to it. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Lawrence, did you want to speak to iFlyTech and whether or not any other corporations are?
And I actually also just wanted, you had asked about what we know about the written assurances that the Chinese government had provided. So I don't think we've seen the written assurances. Sophie may know more on that. But the evaluation commission, which evaluated the candidates for the host city for the 2022 Olympics, it produced a report in which it summarized China's assurances as regarding the following matters, quote, human rights, the right to demonstrate, media freedom to report on the games with no restrictions on the internet, labor rights, displacement and environmental protection. And the Commission said, taking these into consideration, as well as the open nature of the discussions with Beijing 2022 and government authorities, and China's experience in organizing the 2008 Olympic Games and the 2014 Youth Olympic Games, the Commission is confident that the government of China would take all necessary measures to ensure the Olympic Charter and host city contract would be respected. So in other words, China apparently made assurances covering a pretty broad range of issues: human rights, right to demonstrate, media freedom, labor rights, displacement, environmental protection, but we haven't seen those written assurances.
So it's a promise with no penalty? Is that what you're saying too?
I
mean, they don't follow any of the ILO guidelines on labor, International Labor Organization. Demonstrate? Can you imagine somebody demonstrating at Tiananmen Square about the Uyghurs, an athlete or coach or anyone else?
I guess I'm curious, given that China made these assurances, I would love to know if there is any effort any conversation between the IOC and China on those issues. But again, maybe Sophie may know more on that.
Sophie.
I can only add that what Susan has just quoted is the only information that is public. If there is more written down someplace about those assurances, but if I can use that as an opportunity just to get in a little bit on the question of what happens or what if nothing happens, right? What if nothing changes? To point to the 2008 games, first of all, as a very specific occasion for which some precise human rights commitments were made and not upheld, where a prominent international organization said that it had gotten assurances and then never told anybody really what they were, so that we couldn't really know what had happened. But also, let's recall that the Chinese government used the 2008 games as one of the justifications for a pretty significant expansion of the domestic security apparatus and the beginning of the use of surveillance technology that we all now know has expanded considerably. I'm interested in following up on the point about iFlyTech, since we've done work on its complicity with voice recognition for public security bureau databases. But I also think this all contributed to a sense of extraordinary impunity for the Chinese government. Then and now, people who are responsible for human rights crimes do not believe that they will ever be held accountable. And I think it is incumbent on the US government and other like-minded governments to make that happen. And there was a good discussion at the UN last week between the US and like-minded governments about how to take steps forward. But Mr. Smith, to answer your question, what if nothing happens? Let's imagine what the world looks like 10 years from now. If there is really no check on the Chinese government's abuses or its sense of obligation to be transparent or to provide information or play by rules, It's not an appealing prospect.
Thank you, Dr. Richardson. I'd like to yield to co-chair McGovern, unless anyone else wants.
Yeah, hey, thank you very much. Let me thank you all for your testimony, and let me kind of summarize what I'm getting from everybody here. One is that business as usual is complicity in atrocities for corporate sponsors and the IOC. The IOC should delay and relocate the 2022 Olympics if China doesn't change its behavior. And then if the 2022 Olympics remain in Beijing, we should unite to call for diplomatic boycott and corporate sponsors to withdraw their support. I mean, that's my kind of takeaway from, in general, from what I'm hearing today. And I just want to make sure I'm also correct on another thing. The American corporate sponsors have been called on by you and by others to use their influential voice to demand improvements in the human rights behavior of the Chinese host government. And I also understand that I have here a coalition of 190 NGOs, Uyghurs, Tibetans, a whole, to name, there's a couple, wrote to Airbnb and Snickers specifically with such concerns. It is my understanding that none of they have not been responsive. Does anybody disagree with me on that? All right, let me direct this first question to Ms. Richardson. Can you speak to whether the top Olympic partners have been good corporate citizens in China? Now, I understand that Airbnb has allowed its listings in China to openly discriminate against Uyghurs, Tibetans, and other ethnic minorities, and that Intel has sold advanced computing chips to companies and security agencies that facilitate mass surveillance of Uyghurs and others in Xinjiang. Is there any reason that their choice to sponsor the Beijing Olympics should not draw the spotlight to their complicity in human rights abuses in China?
Well, they haven't been, Mr. McGovern, good corporate citizens in China in the sense that, certainly as far as I'm aware, not a single one of the top sponsors has published the kind of human rights due diligence assessment that the UN guidelines expect. And they expect for those assessments to be made public. And, you know, HRW is a proud member of the Coalition to End Forced Labor in the Uyghur region. And that's as much out of concerns about forced labor as it is about companies' inability and or unwillingness, it can be hard to tell which it is, to even try to do the kind of human rights due diligence that's necessary to show that business operations aren't creating or contributing to human rights violations, and if they are, that there's some kind of redress. So, you know, when these companies start publishing these assessments to show that their engagement, either in the Olympics specifically or more broadly, isn't a problem, it will become a different kind of conversation. But unless and until they do that, it's very hard to take seriously, you know, this general sense that sponsoring a feel-good event like the Olympics is a good thing.
Thank you. Mr. Young, NBC Comcast has broadcast rights for the Olympics. How would you counsel them to use their media reach and freedom of expression to address the Chinese government's rights abuses and lack of transparency now and into the next year if the games aren't moved?
This is a very tough question. I think this news outlet should try to not only cover the games, that's what Chinese government wanted. Actually is in the contract, I look at the contract, I forgot, but there's some part about freedom of press during 8 weeks of Olympics. You know, it's allowed, and China actually promised for that. Actually, that's the only focused on the games themselves. So I would encourage those news outlets to expand their coverage. Of course, by doing so may risk being harassed or even thrown away out of China. but I think it's worth trying. They have to cover the stories related to the games, not only the games, about how China prepare for the games, what kind of a thing they have done to displace those called, the troublemakers, potential troublemakers.
Right.
And, about the labor, about how they use the floating population, all these issues, they should be alert to. Yeah.
Right. No, and look at, we talk about freedom of the press. Well, that means that you have freedom of the press. The press can cover whatever stories they want. And if they're restricted in any way, and they're told only cover stories in this particular category, well, then that's not true freedom of the press. And if China doesn't like it, then maybe they should not be covering the Olympics and giving China this international platform to highlight whatever the government of China wants to highlight. And so I appreciate your answer. Ms. Lawrence, I understand that a portion of the money that the top corporate sponsors give to the IOC is distributed back to the National Olympic Committees, including the U.S. Olympic and Paralympic Committee. Is there any reason that American corporate sponsors can't directly support American athletes by contributing directly to the United States Olympic and Paralympic Committee rather than subsidizing the Chinese host entities by passing it through the IOC?
I'm afraid, Chairman McGovern, I'm not familiar with the details of the financial arrangements.
Does because is there any way for them to target the money, or does anyone have an answer to that? Because that's, we all want to support our athletes. We all want to support the training of our athletes, and we want the best, but we don't want to support, a government that is guilty of these human rights crimes. Anyway, maybe that's a question I need to, if we ever get a chance to talk to the committee, the IOC, maybe we'll get a chance to ask them directly. I just want one final question to Mr. Chu, and I think Mr. Smith, I think raised this question. I'm not sure I heard the answer, but the U.S. Olympic and Paralympic Committee has stated, and I quote, it will not sanction Team USA athletes for respectfully demonstrating in support of racial and social justice for all human beings, end quote. However, Rule 50 of the Olympic Charter states, and I quote, no kind of demonstration or political, religious, or racial propaganda is permitted in any Olympic sites, venues, or other areas, end quote. So what role do you think the USOPC should have in protecting U.S. athletes from being punished by Chinese authorities? And how does Hong Kong's experience with free expression inform us?
Thank you, Chairman McGovern. I think that it is, you have a preview of the kind of censorship that you will see in the Olympics in Hong Kong. You can't wear shirts with slogans. You can't actually say those slogans publicly in Hong Kong under the national security law. And what you post on social media are now used as a basis of prosecution under national security. So what you are referencing exactly is that I think that it is up to us, and HKDC and Hong Kongers would be happy to join in and do it, not just briefing athletes on the atrocities that are happening, but I think that there should be know your rights briefings of actually telling athletes exactly the kind of potential consequences that they might run into, and that there are no actual protections for any of the athletes who are going in if they do speak out and demonstrate. And I think that this is actually a very important part that speakers, Pelosi earlier said that about the diplomatic boycott, in not sending, and actually, let's be honest, you and Mr. Smith, for example, are probably banned from actually going at all. And I think that it's important that, and here's one suggestion. And if we do a diplomatic boycott, if none of the officials go, I think that we should, I volunteer to be a representative of the U.S. as a human rights activist to go on behalf of our country, to demonstrate the limits on the speaking out and the demonstration that is to be allowed under the Chinese regime. And I would be gladly be the one to volunteer to go. And because all of these are real risk and threats that we should make every athlete be very clear about before they ever get on a plane and set foot on China soil.
Well, thank you. And I want to thank my colleague, Mr. Smith, for putting this hearing together. And as I said, the China Commission is going to be focused on this quite a bit in the coming weeks and months. But I have to tell you that we're even having this discussion. It's really quite chilling. We all know what's happening in China. We all know the extent of the atrocities against the Uyghurs, not to mention the people in Hong Kong, not to mention the Tibetans, not to mention human rights defenders all over China. I mean, we know what's happening. And that we might proceed with business as usual on a major global event, the Olympics, which captivates world attention, that we may proceed as business as usual when all this is going on. I mean, what does that say about us and the international community if there's not some sort of response? I mean, if genocide, if all this does not offend us, it does not compel us to do something, then really we don't have any moral authority to speak about human rights anywhere in the world. We just don't. And so this is a an important moment. And then the final thing I'm going to say is, you know what? I'm so sick of corporations playing this. I see no evil, hear no evil. There's I mean, these things may be going on, but I don't know. Everybody knows what's going on now. There's no excuse. That's why we're moving legislation forward to tighten up the rules in terms of exports from the Xinjiang region. Everybody knows what's going on. Enough, right? Enough of this. So I appreciate everybody here. And again, Mr. Smith, thank you very much for your leadership and for your continued strong voice on this issue. And we will be working with all of you in the weeks and months ahead. So I thank you, and I yield back my time.
I thank my good friend for his leadership as well. And I'd like to now recognize Ms. Wexton. Jennifer?
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you all for joining us today, the witnesses, for your very thought-provoking testimony. Now, I'm new to the commission, and I'm very honored to be here. My district is in Northern Virginia, which has the highest population of Uyghurs in the United States. And Chairman Smith, I want to let you know that I occupy the seat that Frank Wolf held for 38 years. And even though I'm from a different political party, I was always very, very impressed by his record on human rights and his passion for this cause. So I'm even more honored to be here following in his footsteps. And because I have so many Uyghur constituents, that's one of the reasons I asked to be on this commission, to be a voice for them and their families back home who are being arbitrarily detained, subject to forced labor, forced sterilization, sexual assault, some of the worst crimes against humanity that you can think of, all at the hands of the CCP. And one of the most frustrating things for me over the past few years has been watching the abuses grow in their scale and their brutality. Despite all the tough talk from the previous administration, hundreds of new internment camps were built in Xinjiang over the last 3 years, many with factories built on site to take advantage of detainee labor. And despite all the attention on Uyghur forced labor, imports from Xinjiang to the US remarkably doubled last year. And despite the overwhelming evidence of draconian population control measures being used against Uyghurs, including forced sterilizations, forced abortions, and rape, the CCP has been undeterred. And so it seems to me that we really need to step up the pressure. And as much as I would love for the IOC to do the right thing, I really am not so naive as to believe that they will. And I'm starting to come to the conclusion that we may need to boycott the 2022 Beijing Olympic Games. And I just don't see how we can participate while the host nation is committing genocide. So for anybody on the panel who has any thoughts on this, if the US were to boycott, how important is it that we get other countries to join our efforts? And where do we stand in terms of being able to rally other countries for an issue like this, in the current political climate? I see, I guess, is that you, Sophie, who seems very adamant to answer this question?
Well, thanks, Representative Wexton, and it's nice to think about Mr. Wolf too, who I assume is cheering us all on in this conversation. I think the Chinese government takes a very different measure of some sort of gesture or action if it's undertaken only by one government, as opposed to if it's undertaken by many in coordination. 18 governments co-sponsored a high-level virtual segment at the UN last week specifically to talk about the pursuit of accountability for human rights crimes in the Uyghur region. And I think it's fair to say that there was a disproportionate response by the Chinese government, which then promptly circulated a letter telling all missions to the UN not to attend. The Chinese delegation did then itself choose to attend, which seemed a little ironic. But Beijing will almost always be able, in situations like the UN, to make or create a coalition of large numbers. But I think we are starting to see interesting coalitions of states come together. And, it's an organization that works worldwide and works with parliamentarians across the EU or Japan or Australia. I think there's a lot of interest in working together with fellow legislators on an issue like this to take similar positions, whether it's on how to participate in the games, if at all, whether it's about imposing comparable standards around human rights due diligence on sponsors, since obviously they're not all American, what to say to athletes. The more coordination there can be, the better. And I'll just one last quick hat tip, to the recent round of sanctions, the coordinated sanctions that were announced recently. That was the US, the UK, Canada, and helped the EU for the first time. That I think those registered very differently to the Chinese government, even though it was a small number of individuals. Doing things broadly and in coordination makes an enormous difference.
And do you believe that the U.S. still has the credibility and the gravitas to be able to do that in the current political climate?
I don't even think it's a question of gravitas. I mean, this is a hard question to answer in 30 seconds, but especially for governments that had to, I think, step out into the direct line of fire over the last couple of years when the Trump administration was stepping back from different kinds of arenas like the Human Rights Council. I think many of those governments are very glad to have the opportunity to coordinate with the US again. And, for an event that started out last week with just a couple of co-sponsors, and by the time it took off, had 18 on an issue that most governments, are somewhat reluctant to talk about publicly at all, yet let alone align at such a sort of politically prominent event, I think is indicative of how much enthusiasm there is for coordinating around these issues.
Thank you. Does anybody else on the panel wish to address this issue?
Yes, I agree with what Sophie just said. It will make major difference if all the countries, the allies, come together to do the same thing. For sure, China will actively engage in dividing and conquering strategy with various countries in months to come, and they are very good at it. So I think this issue, whether to participate or boycott, will divide the international community and even our own society. So the division only works to the advantage of China. So we must, it takes a tremendous coordination, negotiation among US and its allies to come up with a package of strategies that tend to be uniting instead of dividing. So Chairman McGovern just summarized the strategy, I think, which is good. we should have a package of the strategies, the strategies consisting of different components, which tend to be uniting. Because some countries may for diplomatic boycott, some say, relocation of the venue. So we can, prioritize and also come up with the conditions that we can lay down on the table to the Chinese to let them to choose. If you don't change your behavior, by what time? The boycott will based on the concessions they have made or no concessions they will have made. So far, US, Canada, UK, and Netherlands have a determination of a genocide, China's Uyghur genocide. I think we can begin with these 4 countries. If you have such a determination, your action must be commensurate with your decision. And the UN Genocide Convention obligates us to do something. We have to come up with action. So I think we can begin with these 4 countries. In summary, coordination, all the countries come together to do the same thing is very, very important.
Wonderful.
Yeah. If I might jump in here.
Sure.
Can you hear me? So I would agree with that. And it seems to me that the US, Canada, UK, Netherlands together are obligated under their being signatories of the Genocide Convention to take action. And interestingly, the US and Canada are in a really good position to offer to host the Olympics. So Vancouver, Canada hosted the Winter Olympics in 2010. Salt Lake City has hosted it. Lake Placid hosted it twice. And we need a city to step up and offer. So I think that would be a very powerful thing around which other countries could rally. I really feel like if one country would just take a powerful and courageous leadership role, that there would be a huge domino effect. And I believe that this hearing could be sort of the epicenter of that. I just think I praise the courage of the people, Congressman Chris Smith and others who are holding this hearing. I would ask the other countries, Canada, the UK, the Netherlands, to hold similar hearings. We can get together and come up with a plan, hopefully to move the games, and if not, to boycott. And then also avail ourselves of the remedies under the Genocide Convention, which I mentioned before. So Article 8 of the Genocide Convention says any contracting party may call upon the United Nations to take such actions as they consider appropriate for the prevention and the suppression of acts of genocide. So any country, that includes us, that includes Canada, UK, Netherlands, any contracting party can call upon the United Nations to take action. That would be a good thing to do. I understand that Article 9 of the International Criminal Court, that the Chinese government reserved that. But under Article 5 of the Genocide Convention, the United States and the rest of these countries have agreed to enact necessary legislation to give effect to the provisions of the present convention, and in particular to provide effective penalties for persons guilty of genocide. So these are all obligations and opportunities that we have under the Genocide Convention. And I would also like to say that I think that one of the most effective things that could possibly be done would be something that I believe Congressman Smith mentioned, which is having a hearing and inviting the corporate sponsors to answer as to why almost all of them, probably all of them, have some kind of statements that they're in favor of human rights and that they uphold human rights as a part of the values of their company, and yet they are sponsoring the Olympics in a genocidal regime.
Yeah. And looking the other way on their supply chains as well. So, but
right, yeah, I mean,
another hearing. That's a whole other hearing.
That's right. Because we got a lot to say about that.
Thank you very much. I'll yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, Ms. Wexton. And we are going to try to get those corporate sponsors to come and testify. We've already invited, like I said, the IOC and the U.S. affiliate. They just sent a statement that's very much like the statement that was made to every member of Congress in a letter. I think they need to be on the record answering questions, and so stay tuned. We'll put those letters out shortly of invitation because they need to be held to account, and we want to hear what they got to say. But thank you, Ms. Wexton, for your questions and participation. I'd like to now recognize Mr. Bilirakis. Is Gus still with us? Okay. Sheila Jackson-Lee, are you there? Are there any other members that are in the queue that would like to ask a question? If not, and if they come on in any second now, I'll go right to them. Let me just say very briefly to you, Mr. Chu, if you wouldn't mind giving an update on how Martin Lee, Joshua Wong, and Jimmy Lai are doing. And you said something very profound in your statement when you opened up. Every public face of the pro-democracy movement is now either in jail, in de facto political house arrest, without the rights to free speech and civic engagement, or living in exile. I would point out parenthetically that Xi Jinping's move to clamp down and to oppress Hong Kong, we saw the beginnings of that with the Umbrella Movement. I introduced the Hong Kong Human Rights and Democracy Act in 2014. A lot of people thought it was a solution in search of a problem, but we saw where Xi Jinping was going with this, and now he has completely destroyed the autonomy, but the human rights of the Hong Kong people. And in like manner, the suppression of the Uyghurs started pretty much around the same time. All of that concurrently with the designation and the so-called due diligence that was done by the IOC to pick Beijing as the venue. All of these terrible human rights atrocities that we're now seeing the bitter fruit of were already well underway in planning stages and implementation as they awarded the Olympics. They got a paper promise that said, yeah, this is what, they're going to be good on labor rights. Are you kidding me? A country that I've had hearings in the past, I would say to my colleagues, with people who tried to form labor unions in China. They go to prison. There's no independent labor movement. There's a government-run labor movement, which is a farce, but everyone else, they go to prison. It's just part and parcel of everything that this Chinese Communist Party has done. And unfortunately, they're bad and getting worse. So, Mr. Chu, if you wanted to speak to that, I think, Reggie Littlejohn, you were going to speak further to remedies. I think you kind of did, but you might want to add anything else. I would just point out for the record, again, one of the 5 criteria is forced abortion and sterilization, reduction of births. The numbers are staggering coming out of the Uyghur heartland. They fell by a staggering 84%, the growth rate between 2015 and 2018, another 24% in 2019, with declines between 30 and 56% in some majority Uyghur districts since. I mean, it is just outrageous how they are achieving genocide through all means that are articulated in the Genocide Convention, including destroying and slaughtering the children. It's just beyond words horrible. So, Mr. Chu, if you wanted to speak, and then if any of our distinguished witnesses have any final comments they would like to make before we close, we'd love to hear them. Mr. Chu?
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Mr. Smith. And I think specifically, as you mentioned, almost everyone that has ever testified in front of either the Commission on China or in Congress are now behind bars. And I want to point out a very specific, the basis of the challenge. Martin Lee, who is widely known as the founding father of the democratic movement in Hong Kong, was charged and convicted for attending a peaceful demonstration, as was Lee Cheuk-yan and Margaret Ng and a number of other leading pro-democracy activists. They simply showed up at a public peaceful march for Hong Kong. And I think that the most recent rash of arrest and conviction on attending peaceful demonstration is very much a messaging on the eve of a 32nd anniversary of the Tiananmen Square massacre. The Hong Kong government has already made it clear, and the leaders have already made it clear, that participating in any commemorative vigils for June 4th is illegal and will be deemed as illegal. And any lawmakers who participate, any district councilor will be disqualified immediately. Any regular residents of Hong Kong joining and showing up at the vigil would be deemed as participating in an illegal assembly. The other thing that I think, as you mentioned, is that one of the tactics that they're using is that people like Joshua Wong and Jimmy Lai, who are already in jail, has been continuously prosecuted, even after they have been convicted and detained and jailed, because the tactic that they're using is that they want to ensure that anyone who has a recognized voice and face globally for the freedom and autonomy of Hong Kong, and anything that's happening in China, are kept behind bars indefinitely for as long as possible. And that these tactics are being ramped up as we lead towards the Olympic, and not actually even being hidden, done behind the scene. These are happening in plain sight for the world to see. The national security law has now been used to arrest more than 100 people. And in order for you to even negotiate bail conditions, so even before you go to trial, activists are being asked to give up their right to speak to foreign media, to speak to foreign lawmakers, to post on social medias, or to participate in any public assembly that would be deemed as against the government and the regime in Beijing. They are literally being asked to exchange their freedom for their political rights, for just to stay out of jail. So I think that what's happening right now is only a very small tip of the iceberg of what will come if we continue to let this go unchecked.
Okay, thank you. Any other members? We have been joined by Senator Ossoff. Yield to my friend for any comments or questions he might have.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate it. Ms. Lawrence, could you please comment on what's known about the extent of forced labor in Chinese supply chains, and then drill down a little bit specifically on Uyghur forced labor in Chinese supply chains?
Thank you for that question. I am not the CRS expert on our forced labor issue, I'm afraid. I believe that Human Rights Watch, Sophie Richardson here representing Human Rights Watch, I believe that they have done a lot of work on that, so she might be better placed. And I certainly can get you information from CRS from my colleagues after the hearing.
Thank you, Ms. Lawrence. Ms. Richardson, I would gladly hear from you on this question, please. Thank you so much.
Sure. Thanks, Susan. Thanks, Senator Ossoff. There are multiple credible reports of not just forced labor, particularly attached to what we refer to as political re-education camps inside the Uyghur region, but also very worrying reports about what are known as labor transfers, meaning people who are recruited is not the right word, essentially, who are offered jobs outside the region by officials inside the Uyghur region. And the concern is really about whether people have any ability to say no and what sorts of conditions they wind up working in once they've been moved outside the region, where often, they have almost no mobility, they don't necessarily have contracts. These are not exactly ILO compliant work situations. The other piece of the puzzle is about the unwillingness or the inability of companies themselves to do adequate human rights due diligence all the way down through their supply chains. And there have been companies found in violation of using forced labor, partly because they hadn't really checked to see where exactly their supply chains went. Some remedies were available to those, but I would commend you, just in the interest of time, to go to the Coalition to End Forced Labor in the Uyghur region for some of the best statistics and the most recent reporting on this.
Thank you so much. I appreciate that. And Ms. Richardson, could you please comment on the extent of surveillance throughout China? And I'd like to hear from you and anyone on the panel with relevant expertise regarding the deployment of artificial intelligence technologies to support the growth of this surveillance regime, as well as on the latest evolution of the so-called social credit system. Thank you.
Senator, the answer to your first question is pervasive and multi-layered. Most parts of the country now, or significant parts of the country are awash in things like, surveillance cameras. There are multiple different ministries with multiple different databases, most notably the Ministry of Public Security, using everything from artificial intelligence to biodata, some of it collected under highly dubious circumstances. We've written about everything from predictive policing to AI to a police app that was designed, that we reverse engineered, that was designed specifically for use in the Uyghur region to track different kinds of behaviors, the vast majority of them legal. But essentially this app would flag up behavior. For example, if you were suddenly going out the front door of your house instead of the back door of your house, or if you were putting gas in somebody else's car, or socializing more or less with your neighbors, there's so much surveillance technology, different streams of it in use across the Uyghur region that, that these kinds of algorithms were literally hardwired to identify individuals who were then deemed suspicious, found for questioning, some of them sent to arbitrary detention. We've written extensively about this topic, but I want to leave room if other people want to jump in, but we'd be happy to send your office more material on this. It's a topic that we continue to write about because essentially the use of this kind of technology in a country where there are no effective privacy rights makes an already incredibly powerful state and security apparatus exponentially more powerful, such that people can know that almost every aspect of their lives, what they're buying, who they're talking to, who they're calling, where they're going, can be known to the authorities and effectively criminalized.
Thank you, Ms. Richardson, and I'll gladly welcome any comments on that subject from other panelists for the record. Ms. Richardson, just sticking with you for one final question, given the discussion of forced labor and supply chains, could you comment on how U.S. policy can more effectively render supply chains, for example, those in the Uyghur region that may involve forced labor, transparent so that the public has full visibility into human rights abuses that may be involved in the manufacture of products imported into the United States?
The problem is, inside China, it's that local authorities and business interests do not allow the kind of human rights audits that are essential, I think, to reassure consumers worldwide that the products they're buying were not made with forced labor. Auditors need to be able to visit factories or other kinds of facilities unannounced. They need to be able to talk to workers without fear of reprisals. They have to be able to do that, with local language skills. And they have to be able to do it across a host of sectors. The problems, I think, are not unique to the cotton industry. Some researchers at Sheffield Hallam University published a fantastic report last week about the solar industry, and that polysilicon is implicated or is tainted with forced labor as well. But I think the Chinese government's response to this is the same as it is to the idea of a UN-sponsored investigation into human rights crimes in the region, which is to say it's none of your business and we're going to block you. And so even if, we're obviously big proponents of the Uyghur Forced Labor Act and of, affording the necessary resources to make that as effective as possible, ultimately the problem really is one of how the Chinese authorities will not open up businesses and factories in that region to that kind of robust independent scrutiny.
Thank you, Ms. Richardson, and all for your testimony. And Ms. Richardson, your comment regarding the solar supply chain is well noted. One of many reasons why, in my view, it's vital that we invest in building our domestic manufacturing capacity for these strategic commodities. Mr. Chair, I yield back and thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you, Senator. Any other members that I can't see on the board that might have joined us? Okay, if not, if anyone would like to make any closing comment from our distinguished witnesses, this would be the time.
Congressman Smith, this is Reggie Littlejohn.
Oh, Reggie, okay.
I would just like to say that something that could be done legislatively would be to enact legislation on country of origin labeling for all products that are bought, especially on the internet, because so often we will buy, there are people who would like to maybe buy American or not buy Chinese products. And yet, if you buy something on the internet where a lot of our purchases happen and it arrives so many times, it's made in China. And I think that there should be some kind of legislation that requires online vendors to label, online what the country of origin is when people are purchasing.
Thank you. Anyone else? Yes, Sophie.
Just one topic that we really haven't talked about much is what's happened to independent civil society in China since the 2008 Olympics, which is, one of, I think, the greatest losses. We're in awe of the people who continue to put everything on the line to try to make human rights a reality for people. But I just want to briefly remember an activist named Ji Suzun, who you may recall, Mr. Smith, was one of the only people who actually tried to apply to get a permit to go into one of the protest zones, the designated protest zones in 2008. And for simply trying to comply with the rules, he was given in 2009 a 3-year sentence by a Fujian court, which then led to a series of other sentences. And he died in July 2019, shortly after being released from custody, as is the horrifying case for a number of activists who have spent time in formal or in arbitrary detention. And I think that's just a powerful statement about one of the differences between the 2008 and the 2022 games, and what's really at stake for people inside China who are trying so hard simply to have basic rights respected.
Right. Thank you, Dr. Richardson.
Yeah.
Yes, Dr. Oh, okay, yes. Dr. Yang?
Oh, yes. I think we should learn from our past success of anti-apartheid initiatives. One of the most effective measures was international boycott against apartheid sports. Reggie mentioned it in her opening remarks. I don't want to repeat. Another thing related I want to talk about is the legal amendment of 1987. So Chairman Smith, you must recall this legislation, which was signed into law, proved to be one of the more effective anti-apartheid sanctions. The amendment denied foreign tax credit for American companies that conducted business or invested in South Africa. So this law led many companies to leave South Africa. As a result, Nelson Mandela praised Representative Rangel for his effort in doing this. I think Congress should consider this type of legislative proposal to deny foreign tax credit for any tax paid or accrued to the People's Republic of China by American companies that are involved in business or other investment in Xinjiang. Before closing, I want to bring to your attention of the issue of torture. In recent years, torture against the prisoners of conscience has become increasingly rampant. In the notorious Xi Jinping's daughter's secret information leaking case, the so-called ringleader of the case, the 20-year-old young man named Liu Tengyu, was hung up by the wrists while naked and whipped hit, and his genitals were burnt with lighter, according to his lawyer and mother. Another two cases, one is Jing Jiaxi, the other Xu Zhiyong, both are very prominent leaders of a civil movement in China. They have been, they are detained and waiting, charged of subversion, waiting for their trials. According to their family members and the lawyers, they have been subjected to starvation, prolonged interrogations, deprivation of sleep, and banned on tiger chairs for punishment for a long period of time. And I really urge Mr. Chairman to host a hearing on this issue on the torture in China.
Thank you very much, Dr. Yan. Just for the record, who's that? Oh, Ms. Rayhan, please, Rayhan, what's up? Thank you. Rayhan, did you want to say something? I thought you indicated.
Yes, I just want to have one final comment. As I advocated for the athletes' right to participate in this game, and especially not taking away their chance, I do hope they also advocate for the American values, and that's incredibly important because if as a sister of a victim who's facing horrific crime, I could lend that compassion, I hope they could do that too. And especially, I love this beautiful quote from the late John Lewis of being good trouble. I hope we learn how to be a good trouble. Thank you.
And Congressman Smith, this is Susan Lawrence. Could I just respond to your question? I think you raised a little bit earlier about media coverage. And I just wanted to flag for your attention that on May 11th, the Overseas Press Club of America spearheaded a letter representing 27 media groups, a letter that they sent to the president of the International Olympic Committee, noting that the Rule 48 of the Olympic Charter states that all decisions concerning coverage of the Games rests with the IOC, and asking the IOCs to ensure that broad coverage is allowed at the 2022 Games. They say press freedom of the sort championed by the Olympics is not limited to coverage of the actual Games. The Olympic Charter states that the IOC will, quote, take all necessary measures to ensure the fullest coverage by different media and the widest possible audiences in the world. And they're basically asking that not just sports journalists be allowed to cover the Olympics, but that journalists be allowed to take stock of China, the nation as a whole. And they have a number of specific points that they have requested, including assurances that international journalists may interview without interference, whoever agrees to be interviewed, and the Chinese government should not retaliate against or arrest sources after the fact, and should establish a hotline for violations, and so on. They have a number of recommendations, but I just wanted to flag for you the existence of that letter.
Thank you so much.
If I can,
yes, please. Oh, sure.
So I want to close by just first of all thanking Chairman Smith for your relentless commitment and advocacy to this. I think that all of us joined in recognizing, I think, the leadership that you have given to all the movement and to all the people who have been persecuted. I want to just close, I think, with a comment that I think nothing in, it's often been said, nothing in history is inevitable. China or any repressive regime will not inevitably open up just because we wait for it. The Olympics does not have to happen in Beijing. It is not inevitable, but it requires very clear moral commitment and immediate urgent action. And again, I just want to repeat the same point that I made in my opening remarks. We probably won't have anything that we come up with will change the immediate future of Hong Kong or Tibet or the Uyghurs and ethnic minorities. But this is the opportunity to demonstrate that we have the political will and the moral fortitude to do something together. That is, I think, an important reminder that it is up to us, that the outcome to the people and to the games and to whatever happens next is not inevitable, but it is up to us. So thank you so much, Chairman Smith.
Thank you so very much, Mr. Chu. All of your testimonies have been outstanding, powerful, and motivating. We will invite to a hearing. We've already invited the IOC and the U.S. Olympic Committee. We'll invite to the next one corporate sponsors. Let's hear what they got to say. I would just say, in final, Dr. Yang, your point about torture. I have chaired, and you've actually participated in one of those hearings when we talked about the chair and these hideous methods of torture that are routinely imposed upon political and religious prisoners, prisoners of conscience, or people who just happen to be Muslim Uyghurs, and they are then subjected to a horrifying torture. And so I think it's time for another hearing, because I think most people, in a way, don't believe it until they hear from the torture victims themselves, and they hear from people who really can tell the truth. And Xi Jinping is the mastermind of all of that. The UN in the past has looked into this. The Special Rapporteur for Torture, Manfred Nowak, for example, one of them, they don't get access. They write very good reports, but they're unable to have the kind of access that is required. So they need to do interviews with people who have suffered this gross indignity. And again, the Torture Convention is something that we're all very concerned about as well. But let me just conclude. Marco Rubio had chaired, and I was then the co-chair of the China Commission, a hearing where we had a woman, a Uyghur woman named Miracle Tursum, who talked about how she asked Allah to take her life because she couldn't take the torture anymore. They abused her horribly, she being a mother of three, and she described it in detail, what that torture was all about, and who's responsible. Xi Jinping and the Chinese Communist Party, and we need to, and to reward them with the Olympics is unconscionable. And so we need to up our game and do more to stop this. If I were allowed in, I would go to the games to protest. I went to the 2008 before it started. And one of our witnesses, maybe it was Sophie, had mentioned earlier that we did admonish and ask and plead with the president. Then it was Bush, because we've had, unfortunately, not the greatest reacts from Democrat and Republican presidents in the past. Not to go to the opening ceremony. We put together a group of 6, Frank Wolf and I, dissidents who went in and told him, this is what they do. Please don't be dissuaded. And it was pointed out, I think, by the speaker. He did come to to great consternation of the Chinese government, to the the awarding of the medal to the Dalai Lama. But it's we just need to be always put yourself in their shoes. Some of you have been in those shoes. You've been. Some of you have been tortured. Dr. Yang, you know what it's like to be in a Chinese prison so well. So we're going to, I think, do far more. We have to do more. And again, let's hear from the corporate sponsors and the IOC. Thank you so very much. And this hearing is adjourned. Oh, okay. Did we do it?